Hello everyone, I am Mr. Phantom, and I'm here to help you rest. But before you close your eyes for the night, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it for you? Now make yourself cozy and relax. Story number 1, the first call. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each second echoing louder than it should in the quiet of the house. I glanced over at it, 9:47 p.m. The house felt unnervingly still. Not a sound from outside, no neighbors calling out in the yard or dogs barking in the distance. Just silence. Even the hum of the refrigerator, which normally kept a steady rhythm, seemed distant tonight, like it was purposely quiet. I slouched deeper into the couch, the light from the TV casting shadows on the walls. It was a Saturday night and I was home alone. Normally, I wouldn't mind. I'd grown used to it by now. After all, I'd spent the last few years being the only one left at home while my parents went out. My older brother, Jake, had moved out for college last year, so now it was just me and my parents. They worked long hours, and I, being 18, was old enough to stay by myself, at least for a few hours. My parents weren't strict, but they were overprotective when it came to the house. They had this weird rule about always locking every door and window, even when I was just running to the store for a minute. It used to bug me, but I didn't mind it so much anymore. It gave me a sense of security, I guess. Maybe that's why, when the silence started to feel a little too much, I decided to do my usual checks, make sure everything was locked, that the front door was properly shut, that the back gate was secured. Just little things. After all, I was used to their rules. The house itself was a big one, 2 stories, 4 bedrooms, and the kind of hardwood floors that creaked when you walked on them. The walls were lined with family photos, old ones of us as kids, more recent ones of Jake's graduation and my own high school moments. I could hear the creak of the floorboards upstairs as I moved around. The place had always felt like home, even if it was a little too quiet without my brother there. My parents were out for the night dinner and a movie, they said. They left a few hours ago, and it wasn't until I had finished up my homework that I even realized how late it had gotten. I had planned to watch a movie or scroll through my phone, maybe relax, but instead I kept glancing at the clock, feeling the weight of the quiet pressing in on me. It was always like this when I was home alone, but tonight felt different. The usual comfort of solitude was missing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I took a deep breath and tried to distract myself by flipping through TV channels. Nothing good was on, just reruns of old shows and commercials. I sighed, reaching for my phone to check messages. That's when I noticed the time again, 9:57 p.m. My parents would probably be home soon. I decided to check the house, just as I always did before bed. I got up and walked through the hallway, making my way to the front door. It was locked like always. The windows were all shut tight. I moved to the back of the house, checking the kitchen and the door that led outside. Secure. Everything was exactly as it should be. But even as I stood there in the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something about tonight felt different. I returned to the living room and sat back down. The TV was still on, but I wasn't really watching anymore. I just stared at the screen, my mind wandering. Then suddenly, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I looked down, an unknown number. I stared at it for a moment, unsure if I should answer. It was late, after all. Probably a wrong number or someone trying to sell me something. But something inside me urged me to pick it up. I shrugged and tapped the screen to answer. Hello, my voice was steady, but there was a slight tightness in my chest that I couldn't quite explain. The line was silent. I waited, expecting a response, but all I heard was the softest sound of breathing, like someone was just sitting there listening. Hello, I repeated, trying to sound more confident this time, but there was a tremor in my voice that I couldn't control. Who is this? The breathing continued, slow and deliberate. No words, just that steady, rasping inhale and exhale. I gripped the phone a little tighter, trying to steady myself. Who is this? I demanded again, my voice more forceful now, though it sounded a little shakier than I had intended. The breathing stopped abruptly, a moment of complete silence. Then a voice, low and distorted, cracked through the stillness. James, I see you. My blood ran cold. My hand went limp, almost dropping the phone, but I held on, my pulse hammering in my ears. How did they know my name? The voice, it didn't sound like anyone I knew. The distortion made it almost impossible to tell, but there was no mistaking what was said. I see you. My breath caught in my throat, my mind racing. I dropped the phone, the call still going, the screen still lit up. My heart raced, my entire body frozen in place. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the phone, almost afraid to look at it. The voice. It had to be a prank, right? Just some sick joke. I was alone, maybe I was overreacting. But as the seconds passed, the room felt colder. I didn't feel alone anymore. I grabbed my phone again, pressing it to my ear, but the call had ended. I stared at the screen, still dark. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my frantic thoughts. Maybe I had misheard, or maybe it was just a bad connection. But deep down, something told me that was no coincidence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickly checked every door and window again. Everything was locked, just as it should be. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that someone, was watching me. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, at the dark corners of the room. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. It was probably nothing, just a strange call. But why had they said my name? With one last glance around the living room, I sank back into the couch, trying to focus on the TV again, but the images on the screen were a blur. The house felt different now. Too still, too quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence that comforted me. It felt like something was waiting, something unseen. And then the phone buzzed again. I jumped at the sound of my phone buzzing again. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow across the dim room. It wasn't a time to be casually checking messages, yet I found myself grabbing it almost instinctively. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the screen, my mind racing. It was another unknown number. What was going on? Another call. This couldn't just be a coincidence, could it? I felt a surge of frustration rise in my chest, mixed with unease. The last call had already shaken me more than I cared to admit. I see you. Those words kept repeating in my head. How did they know my name? I lived in a pretty quiet neighborhood. Not a lot of strangers came by. In fact, I didn't know anyone in the area who would pull something like this. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to calm down. It was probably a prank. Kids at school were always doing stuff like this. It was just, well, unsettling. It wasn't like I hadn't heard of creepy prank calls before, but that voice, it didn't feel like a joke. I tapped the screen, answering the call. Hello. My voice was steadier now, but it was still tight from the lingering tension. Again, nothing but silence at first. My thumb hovered over the end call button, ready to hang up if it didn't stop. I wanted to get this over with. But then there it was, the breath, that slow, deliberate inhale followed by a long exhale. It was too familiar now, and the air felt heavier. Who is this? I asked, trying to sound assertive, but my words trembled, betraying my fear. What do you want from me? The breathing continued. No answer. I tried to steady my shaking hand, clutching the phone tighter, my eyes darting around the dark room. I hadn't realized how silent it had gotten again. It was like the whole house had held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then the voice came again. It was softer this time, almost a whisper, but still just as unsettling. I'm coming for you. I froze. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Coming for me? What did that mean? Was this some kind of sick joke, or something worse? I glanced toward the window, feeling paranoid now. There was nothing out there, just the dark, quiet street. My pulse raced. I wanted to hang up, but my finger felt stuck, frozen on the phone. Who are you? I demanded again, though the words felt weak in my mouth. What do you want? The voice on the other end didn't respond right away, and I thought maybe the call had dropped. But no, the breathing came back, slow and steady, just like before. Then faintly, I heard the voice speak again, a little clearer this time. You can't hide, James. I'm already here. The blood drained from my face, and I almost dropped the phone. My heart hammered in my chest, my thoughts a chaotic blur. They were here. Who was here? The words didn't make sense. But the panic was rising quickly, and I could feel the air in the room grow thick, almost suffocating. I jumped up from the couch, my legs weak, but I couldn't sit still. I needed to do something. I had to check the doors again. It was probably just someone messing with me, right? Someone had to be playing some sort of sick prank. I was suddenly aware of how quiet the house had gotten. Even the usual hum of the air conditioner seemed muted, like everything had gone still. I looked out the window again, but nothing. Just darkness. The streetlights outside cast long shadows across the yard, but no movement, no sign of anyone. The house felt huge all of a sudden, like it was swallowing me up. The quiet was overwhelming. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was out there just waiting for me. But there was no way I was letting whatever this was control me. I had to take charge. I forced myself to walk through the house again. I checked the back door, the windows, the locks. Everything was just as it should be. But with every step I felt a growing unease, like someone, was waiting for me in the next room. The house, usually so familiar, suddenly felt foreign. It was too quiet, too still. It wasn't a comforting silence anymore. It was suffocating. Every room seemed darker, even with the lights on. I wasn't just checking the doors anymore. I was looking for something, anything, to tell me that there was nothing wrong, but the house didn't tell me anything. I stood in the middle of the living room for a long moment, listening. I waited for the sound of my parents' car pulling into the driveway, but all I heard was the soft tick of the clock, the creak of the floorboards beneath me. The phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't even realized how much I had been dreading that moment. With shaking hands, I reached for the phone and answered it before I could second-guess myself. "Hello," I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. The same breathing came through the line, but this time it was followed by something different, a soft, sickly laugh. It made my skin crawl. "You can't escape, James," the voice said, the words coming out slow and deliberate, like it was savoring each one. "I'm already here. You can't run from me." My stomach churned and I felt a wave of dizziness hit me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was real anymore. The voice, the laughter, the feeling of being watched, it all blended together and I felt completely helpless. The phone line went dead with a soft click, leaving me in silence once more. But it wasn't the same silence. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was cold, empty, as though something was waiting for me. I stared at the screen of the phone, my hands trembling. The call had ended, but the unease hadn't gone away. If anything, it had only grown stronger. What was happening? Why was this happening to me? I sat there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, staring at the screen. The call had ended, but the words, the voice, it all lingered in my mind. "You can't run from me," it had said. How could something so simple sound so menacing? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Who would do something like this? Why? It wasn't just a prank anymore. It felt personal. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that someone was out there waiting. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind against the windows made my skin crawl. It was too quiet now, too still. A quiet that felt wrong. I felt like I couldn't trust my own senses. What if the caller was telling the truth? What if someone was really out there? I shoved the phone into my pocket and stood up, trying to push the thoughts out of my head. I needed to do something, anything. I couldn't just sit here, waiting for whatever this was to happen. My mind raced. I needed to check the house again. Maybe this time I'd find something. Maybe then I'd feel safe. But as I walked through the house, my steps felt heavy, my feet dragging against the floorboards, making the house feel even emptier. The silence seemed to grow louder with every passing moment. The air felt thicker, like something was pressing down on me. I checked the back door again, even though I'd already locked it. I pulled the curtains back, peering out into the yard. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I moved through the kitchen, then down the hallway toward the stairs. As I reached the bottom of the staircase, my ears strained for any sound, anything that would tell me I wasn't alone. But all I heard was the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the steady beat of my own heart in my chest. I felt like a prisoner in my own home. I glanced over my shoulder toward the front door, half expecting to see a shadow lurking outside, watching me. But there was nothing, no one. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My parents weren't due back for hours. I was alone. And as much as I wanted to believe this was all some sick joke, it didn't feel like one anymore. The voice, the way it knew my name, felt real, too real. I moved back to the living room where I had left the phone, my fingers brushing over the couch as I walked. The phone was still on the coffee table. I picked it up and unlocked the screen. There were no new messages, no new calls. I tried calling my mom's number just to hear her voice, just to hear something normal, but it went straight to voicemail. I hung up and tried my dad, same thing. I was starting to feel completely cut off from the outside world, and that's when it hit me. What if this wasn't just some prank? What if whoever was doing this wasn't calling from just anywhere? What if they were close? I walked toward the front window, staring out into the street. The house was on a quiet road, surrounded by trees. It was peaceful during the day, but now it felt like it was closing in on me. Every shadow outside seemed darker, every rustle of the trees seemed louder. My heart was beating harder now, my breath shallow. I needed to calm down. I needed to think logically. This could be a coincidence. It could just be a wrong number. But everything inside me told me it was. The house was still, too still. I froze. My mind had been racing, but now, as I stood there, I realized something. I wasn't alone. There was a sound in the house, one I hadn't heard before. The faintest creak of the floorboards upstairs, like someone was walking around. I wasn't imagining it. I knew I was. My breath caught in my throat as I stood perfectly still, waiting. The house seemed to hold its breath with me, the silence suffocating. I looked toward the stairs again. The creak was louder now, closer. Whoever was upstairs, they were moving, slowly, deliberately. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind racing. Should I call the police? Should I go upstairs? The fear was paralyzing. The creak came again, louder this time, and then nothing. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Was I hearing things? Maybe it was just the house settling, the wind, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like someone was here with me, someone who shouldn't be. I picked up the phone again, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and for a moment I thought I might faint. The line rang, and I could feel the sweat on my palms, my breath coming too quickly. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice broke through the panic, grounding me. I think someone's in my house, I whispered, barely able to speak. Stay calm, sir. Where are you located? I gave her the address, barely able to get the words out. But even as I spoke, I heard something, a noise from upstairs, a door opening. I wasn't alone. The dispatcher's voice continued to speak to me, but I couldn't focus. I wasn't listening anymore. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the stairs, where the sound of footsteps echoed from above. Soft, slow steps, as if someone was walking deliberately, almost purposefully, with a clear intention. My breath caught in my throat, my hand clutching the phone tightly, knuckles white. Please, you need to send someone. I think there's someone upstairs, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My heart was pounding so loudly I couldn't hear anything else but its thunderous beat. The dispatcher's voice remained calm, a stark contrast to the fear running through my veins. Stay on the line with me, sir. Do you have a weapon or something to defend yourself with? I looked around the room. The only thing close enough was the kitchen knife, just a few feet away. But that felt too far to reach, and I didn't even know if it would help. What if the person was armed? No, I had to think clearly. I couldn't act rashly. Okay, just stay on the line. Help is on the way, the dispatcher continued. But as she spoke, the footsteps upstairs paused and a chilling silence fell over the house again. I held my breath, straining my ears for any sound. I felt like I was suffocating in the stillness. Every second stretched on, longer than the last. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The only thing that existed in that moment was the oppressive silence, broken only by my ragged breathing and the occasional creak of the house settling under the weight of the unknown. Then I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A voice coming from the hallway just above the stairs. James. My blood ran cold, my name spoken so softly, so eerily. There was no mistaking it. It was the same voice from the phone call. I couldn't breathe. My whole body froze in place, every muscle locked in terror. The voice had come from inside the house, but there was no one there. At least not that I could see. Was I going crazy? Was I hearing things? No, no, I whispered to myself, my grip tightening on the phone. I stared at the stairs, eyes wide, waiting for something, anything. But the house remained silent, save for the distant ticking of the clock in the living room and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Time seemed to stand still, my heart racing with every passing second. I had to do something. I couldn't just wait here, paralyzed with fear. I turned slowly, looking around for any sign of movement. I glanced back at the door. Maybe I could make a run for it. Maybe I could get outside, get to safety. But before I could take a step, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps. This time closer, closer than before. I looked back toward the stairs. The footsteps were on the second floor now. Whoever was upstairs was moving closer, and I had no way of knowing if they'd come down to confront me. My palms were slick with sweat, my pulse pounding in my ears. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I wasn't going to survive this by standing still. I looked around the living room, searching for anything that could help me. The kitchen knife, the phone, a chair I could use as a barricade, nothing seemed like it would make a difference. The house felt too small now, too suffocating. "Stay calm, James," I muttered to myself. I had to stay calm. I couldn't let panic take over. The dispatcher's voice came through again, snapping me back to reality. "Sir, are you still there? Stay with me. We're dispatching units now. Help is on the way." I'm here," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's someone upstairs. They're walking around." "Keep the line open," the dispatcher instructed. "Help will be there in minutes. Are you able to lock any doors or secure yourself in a room?" I nodded quickly, my eyes darting around the house again. I could lock myself in my bedroom, but I'd have to pass the stairs to get there. And whoever was upstairs might see me. Or worse, they might hear me. No, I couldn't take that risk. But there was one option. The attic. I could hide in the attic. If I could get up there without being noticed, I could lock myself in. I wasn't sure if I could make it in time, but it was my best shot. I moved cautiously toward the hallway, my steps slow and deliberate. Every creak of the floor beneath my feet sounded too loud, too obvious. My heart was in my throat as I reached the door leading to the attic. I tried to open it as quietly as possible, but the old hinges groaned in protest. I froze, my breath catching. Had anyone heard? Silence. I pushed the door open just a little more and I stepped inside. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the small window near the ceiling. The space was cramped, but I could lock the door from the inside. I turned to shut the door, but just as I did, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft thud. It was coming from behind me. Someone was in the attic with me. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart hammering against my chest. I had barely managed to get the door shut behind me when I heard the noise. The soft thud came again, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. It was faint, almost like the sound of something, or someone, moving in the darkness of the attic. I strained my ears, listening for any other sound. A shuffle of feet, the rustle of clothing, anything that might tell me where the noise was coming from. But there was nothing. Just the creak of the old house settling and the faint sound of my own pulse pounding in my ears. I had to move. I couldn't stay here, trapped in the dark attic with something I couldn't even see, but I wasn't sure if I was safe enough to leave. The only way out was down, where the footsteps had been, where the voice had come from. Whoever was upstairs could be waiting for me. My hands shook as I moved slowly toward the far corner of the attic, trying to make as little noise as possible. The floorboards creaked under my weight and I winced. Every sound felt like it was echoing through the empty space, amplifying the terror inside me. I found an old trunk and crouched behind it, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to make myself as small as possible. The attic was suffocating, the air thick and stale, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. The darkness was so complete that I could barely see my own hand in front of my face, and every shadow seemed to shift, like it was alive. Then I heard it again, a soft scrape like someone dragging their hand along the floor. I held my breath. Was it someone else? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. I wanted to scream, but I knew if I did, I'd be giving myself away. My only choice was to stay quiet, to wait. The thud came again, closer this time, and then another scrape. My eyes darted around the attic, trying to make out any shapes in the dark. I could feel my skin crawling, every inch of me on high alert. Whoever or whatever was here wasn't moving like a person. It was slow, methodical. It wasn't searching for me. It was waiting for me. I tried to steady my breath, my thoughts scattered. I couldn't just sit here, hoping this would all go away. I had to do something. Then I heard a voice that was barely a whisper but unmistakable. "James." I froze, my heart stopping for a second as I listened. It was the same voice, the one from the phone call, the one that had tormented me, that had filled me with dread ever since it first whispered my name. It was here, in the attic, calling for me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. My legs were like lead, my mind clouded by fear. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could do was sit there in the dark and listen. The voice spoke again, this time louder, clearer. "You can't hide from me forever." It was a statement, not a question, a promise. I felt the cold sweat break out on my skin. I had to get out of here. I had to escape. But as I turned to leave, I heard another sound, a scraping, like something was being dragged across the floor. I didn't have time to think. I bolted for the attic door, throwing it open with as much force as I could muster. My legs burned as I raced down the stairs, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I reached the bottom of the stairs and ran into the hallway, my feet pounding against the wooden floors. My breathing was ragged, each step feeling like it might be my last. The front door was just a few feet away, and all I needed to do was reach it. But then, just as I was about to grab the door handle, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, closing in, coming faster now. I turned, my hand still on the door, and there it was. A shadow. It moved across the hallway, dark and silent, but unmistakable in its presence. I slammed my hand against the door, twisting the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, desperate to get out. The footsteps stopped. And then the voice again. "James." It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, commanding. I spun around, panic rising in my chest, but there was nothing there. The house was silent again, too silent. I froze, my back pressed against the door, and strained my ears, listening. The house felt different now, colder. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I could feel my body trembling. The only sound I could hear was my own breath, shallow and ragged. I couldn't stay in this house anymore. I couldn't stay in this silence, where the walls felt like they were watching me, where the air was thick with something I couldn't explain. I had to get out. I tried the door again. This time it opened. I burst outside, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. The night was dark, but at least it felt real. At least I wasn't trapped in the house anymore. But as I took a step forward, I heard it, the softest whisper. "James." I turned quickly, my heart racing. There was nothing behind me, just the empty yard, the dark trees, and the shadows of the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The chill in the air settled deep in my bones, and my breath came out in shaky puffs as I tried to steady myself. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I was standing in the middle of the yard, staring at the dark outline of the house, and I couldn't escape the sense that something was still inside, something that wanted me. I looked over my shoulder, scanning the trees. The yard was empty, the bushes rustling faintly in the wind, but I couldn't get rid of the nagging sense that I wasn't alone. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, like they were weighed down by the fear that still gripped me. My heart pounded, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. Every step I took seemed too loud, too noticeable, like I was drawing attention to myself. I didn't want to go back inside. I didn't want to face whatever or whoever was waiting for me in that house. But I had no choice. I needed to get my phone. I needed to call for help. I turned back toward the house, my feet dragging with every step. I had to keep moving, but the closer I got, the more the house seemed to loom over me, like a giant that was ready to swallow me whole. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but something stopped me. A sudden feeling that this wasn't just any house, that something was wrong with it, something that went deeper than just the strange events that had been happening. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The familiar scent of old wood and dust hit me, but it was different now. It was colder inside, the air thick with something I couldn't explain. The door creaked as I stepped inside and the floorboards groaned under my weight. I glanced around, but the hallway was empty. Everything seemed still, but the silence felt wrong, unnatural. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. I slowly walked through the hallway, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I didn't know why I was so afraid, but I felt like something was coming for me, something that had been waiting. Every creak of the floorboards felt like an alarm going off, every turn of the head, a reminder that I wasn't safe. I reached the living room and turned toward the staircase. My phone was upstairs in the bedroom, plugged into the charger. I had to go up there, but I didn't want to. The stairs loomed ahead, dark and quiet. I couldn't see what was at the top, but I could feel it. Something was up there. I didn't know what, but I was certain of it. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the house was alive and it was watching me. I gripped the banister tightly, my knuckles white, and began to climb the stairs. Each step felt like it took an eternity, my heart racing with every upward movement. The house felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing tighter with each step. My breathing quickened, and the darkness around me seemed to shift, like it was alive, swirling and twisting. When I reached the top, I paused, glancing down the hallway toward the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to make out the faint outline of my phone charging on the nightstand, but I wasn't sure I wanted to go in there. I took a deep breath and moved toward the door, pushing it open slowly. The room was as I had left it, nothing out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The shadows seemed deeper, the air thicker. I felt like I was intruding in a space that wasn't mine anymore. I grabbed my phone and turned to leave, but then I heard it. The sound of a creak from the attic. I froze. My eyes darted to the ceiling where the attic door was closed, the wooden panel blending in with the walls. But the creak came again. It wasn't loud, but it was there, like someone was moving around up there. I stood still for a long moment, not knowing what to do. My fingers tightened around the phone and I slowly backed away from the bedroom door, the dread rising in my chest. The house was not just haunted, it was alive, and it was playing with me. I turned toward the stairs, but before I could take a step, the doorbell rang. I didn't move. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I didn't hear it, but it rang again, and again. 3 times, quick and insistent. It wasn't just a visitor, it wasn't just anyone at the door. It was the same as the last time. The sound of the doorbell ringing was unmistakable, the same eerie tone that echoed in my mind like a warning. The thing that had been calling me, that had been whispering my name over and over, was at the door. I felt my legs tremble and I wanted to bolt, to run out the back and disappear into the night. But I couldn't. Not with the doorbell ringing, not with whatever was in the attic, not with the house feeling like it was closing in on me. I stepped toward the stairs, my hands trembling as I gripped the railing. There was no escaping it. The house had me. It had been waiting for me. I moved to the edge of the staircase, my heart pounding in my chest, and peered down at the door. But I didn't have the courage to go downstairs. Not yet. I needed answers. I needed to know what was really happening in this house, and I had a feeling I wasn't going to like what I found. I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor as the sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, once again, louder this time. It was as if the house itself was mocking me, daring me to face what was on the other side of the door. I stood frozen at the top of the stairs, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out all other sounds. The fear that had been building since the first call was now a solid, suffocating weight pressing down on me. There was something out there, something I couldn't understand, couldn't control. Something that had been lurking, waiting, from the moment I answered that first phone call. I glanced nervously down the staircase, my breath shallow. The dark hallway at the bottom of the stairs stretched out like an abyss, and I could feel the presence of whatever or whoever was out there. I didn't want to go down there, but I had no choice. The doorbell rang again, and this time it seemed louder, more urgent, like it knew I was there, knew I was listening. I took a deep breath and steeled myself. This was it. I had to find out what was happening. I stepped carefully down the stairs, each creak of the floorboards making my pulse spike. The darkness of the hallway below was overwhelming, and the air was thick with tension. I had to force myself to keep moving, to keep putting one foot in front of the other. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze. The front door was wide open. I hadn't opened it, I hadn't touched the door. The space between the door frame and the door was dark and empty. No one was standing there. But the door was open, and the wind outside had picked up, rustling the trees and sending a chill through the house. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I had imagined it, but there was no denying it. The door was open, the door that had been closed just moments before. I stepped forward slowly, my footsteps echoing through the silent house. I reached for the door, and as my fingers brushed the handle, I heard a soft sound coming from inside the house, like the creaking of old wood, the sound of someone moving. I spun around, my heart racing. There was nothing there. Just the empty hallway, the same stillness that had been there before. But it felt different now, like the very air had shifted, charged with a strange energy. I turned back to the door, and with a deep breath, I pushed it open. The night outside was cold and quiet, the sky dark with no stars in sight. The moon was hidden behind clouds, casting the world in shadows. But there, just beyond the threshold of the house, was something I hadn't expected. A figure, standing in the yard, shrouded in darkness, a silhouette against the faint light from the street lamp. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel the presence of this person. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my pulse quickened as I stared at them. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there frozen with fear. I had to act. But before I could move, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows, melting into the darkness like it had never been there at all. I blinked, confused, my mind racing. What the hell had just happened? I took a hesitant step forward, my gaze scanning the yard for any sign of movement, but the figure was gone. There was no one there, no trace. I stood at the door, staring out into the night, the fear slowly fading into a mix of confusion and disbelief. Was I losing my mind? Had I imagined it? I slammed the door shut, the noise reverberating through the house. I leaned against it, my heart still pounding in my chest, but the panic had subsided, at least for now. I had to get my bearings, I had to think. I couldn't keep running from this. I turned around and froze again. The phone. It was sitting on the kitchen counter just where I had left it. I hadn't heard it ring, hadn't noticed it in the chaos of the last few minutes. But now it was there, sitting silently, almost waiting for me. I walked over to it cautiously, and as soon as my hand touched the screen, it buzzed to life. The screen lit up with a new notification, one I hadn't seen before. A new message. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the words, and as I read them, the blood drained from my face. It was from the same unknown number. The message was simple but chilling. I'm inside. I've been here all along. I dropped the phone, the cold message echoing in my mind like a death sentence. How could this be happening? I wasn't alone, but it wasn't just the phone calls. It wasn't just the doorbell. Whoever or whatever was tormenting me had been here in this house for far longer than I realized. And now they were waiting. I stood frozen, my breath shallow as the message flashed on my phone. The words felt like ice, sinking deep into my chest, choking me with every passing second. I'm inside. I've been here all along. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to run out of the house and never look back, but my feet felt like they were stuck in cement. The walls of the house seemed to close in around me, and the air, thick with fear, pressed against my chest. What did it mean? Who had been inside this entire time, and why hadn't I heard anything? I turned my head slowly, scanning the room. The living room was eerily quiet, too quiet. It was as though the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The silence was suffocating. I didn't trust it. I grabbed the phone again, my hands trembling as I stared at the screen. The message was still there. I couldn't take my eyes off it, as though reading it over and over would somehow make sense of the chaos swirling inside my mind. But it didn't make sense. Nothing did. I needed to check every room. I needed to know if someone was here, if they had been watching me, waiting for the right moment. I started with the kitchen. The room was empty, the dishes still piled up on the counter where I had left them earlier. But something felt off. The air in the room was too still, and the shadows seemed longer, deeper than they should be. I moved to the hallway, my footsteps loud on the hardwood floors. The house felt bigger now, stretching out endlessly in all directions. I had always known it was old, but now it seemed alive. The walls seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, the silence inside the house oppressive. I checked the bathroom, the bedrooms, the closets. I even looked inside the basement, though I already knew no one would be there. The house was empty. Or so I thought. I paused in the hallway, suddenly aware of the growing sense that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the phone call. It wasn't just the message. Something had changed inside this house. It had changed since I first stepped in, since that first night I had heard the strange ringing phone. I could feel it now, the weight of something lurking just beyond my perception. Something watching me. Something that wasn't human. I turned back toward the living room, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The shadows in the corner of the room shifted, just slightly, as if something had moved or was moving out of sight. I walked toward the living room cautiously, my eyes darting to every corner of the room. My breath quickened, and I could feel my heart racing, but I didn't dare stop. I had to keep moving, keep looking, or I would lose my mind. I turned the corner into the living room and stopped dead in my tracks. The phone was gone. The kitchen counter, where I had left it only moments ago, was empty. The phone that had just sent me that chilling message was nowhere to be found. I checked the counter, the couch, the coffee table. Nothing. The phone had disappeared, leaving only an unsettling emptiness in its wake. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and I felt the familiar wave of panic begin to rise again. I retraced my steps, searching frantically. I was desperate to find it, to hold it again and see if anything had changed, but the phone was gone. The house was quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it. A soft noise from the hallway, footsteps, faint but unmistakable. I froze. I didn't dare move, listening intently, trying to locate the source of the sound. But the footsteps weren't the only thing I heard. There was something else, something that sent a shiver crawling up my spine. A low whisper, barely audible but there. My name. James. I snapped my head toward the hallway. No one was there. James, the voice came again, softer this time, like a breath in the dark. It was close, too close. I backed away slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't see anyone, but the whispering voice was unmistakable. It was inside the house. It was coming from somewhere close. And then, as if on cue, I heard the doorbell again. It rang once, then twice, then 3 times. But this time it wasn't just the doorbell. The noise grew, warping, twisting. It wasn't a ringing sound anymore. It was a distorted, jumbled noise, as if the doorbell was being stretched, pulled out of shape by some unseen force. I felt my legs weaken. I couldn't breathe. The doorbell was no longer just a sound. It was a warning, a signal that something terrible was about to happen. I bolted for the door, grabbing the handle with shaking hands. But before I could open it, I froze again. The house was different now. The air was colder, heavier. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched longer, more menacing. I was trapped. I had to get out, but where could I go? I stumbled back into the hallway, the floor creaking under my weight. The whispers were louder now, all around me. They were coming from every direction, from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling. The house was alive with the sound of my name. I wanted to scream, to break down and cry, but I couldn't. I couldn't let myself fall apart. I had to find out what was going on, what this house wanted from me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. Silence, absolute silence. The doorbell stopped ringing, the air was still, the house felt empty again. I stood there in the middle of the hallway, trying to steady my breath. I didn't know how much more of this I could take. But I had no choice. I had to keep moving forward. The silence that followed was the worst part, the calm after the storm. I stood frozen in the hallway, unable to shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, twisting and pulling at my sanity. The oppressive weight of the house hung heavily on my shoulders. I tried to steady my breath, but it was useless. My chest was tight, constricted by an unseen force. My heart pounded in my ears, louder than ever. The stillness was suffocating. I needed to do something. I needed to escape this nightmare, but where could I go? The doors were locked, the windows sealed shut. I had no way out. The house had become a prison, and I was trapped inside with whatever was watching me, whatever was toying with me. I turned toward the stairs. I had to check the second floor, make sure there were no hidden rooms, no secret passages, nothing that could explain the strange occurrences. I couldn't afford to leave any corner unchecked. I climbed the stairs slowly, my footsteps echoing in the dark. Every creak of the wooden steps felt like a warning, a reminder that something was wrong. Something wasn't right in this house. At the top of the stairs, I paused, scanning the hallway. There were 3 doors, one to the left, one to the right, and one straight ahead. All of them were closed. I moved toward the first door, my hand hovering over the knob. My fingers trembled, my mind racing. What was I going to find? What was waiting behind the door? I opened it slowly, the door creaking on its hinges, the sound piercing the silence like a scream. The room was empty, no hidden secrets, no strange figures waiting for me. But it felt wrong. The air was too cold, too still. The room was untouched, like no one had been in there for years. I stepped inside, my gaze darting around the room. The bed was made, the dresser organized. But on the nightstand, something caught my eye. A small note folded neatly. It looked fresh, as though someone had placed it there only moments ago. I reached for it with shaky hands, unfolding the paper. My eyes scanned the words written in messy, hurried handwriting. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The breath caught in my throat. The words seemed to mock me like a cruel joke, but there was something more behind them, something deeper. Whoever had left this note knew something I didn't. They knew what was coming. I crumpled the note in my hand and turned toward the next door. There was no time to waste. I opened the second door and stepped inside. This room was different. It wasn't a bedroom. It was a study. Bookshelves lined the walls and a desk sat in the center of the room. Papers were scattered across the desk, and a lamp flickered weakly in the corner. The room was covered in dust, like it hadn't been used in years. I stepped forward, my eyes scanning the desk. There were more papers, old documents, photographs, and what looked like a journal. I reached for it, feeling the weight of the book as I lifted it from the desk. The leather cover was cracked, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. I flipped through the pages, reading snippets of what looked like someone's personal accounts. But the words didn't make sense. They spoke of strange happenings, things that couldn't be explained. I skimmed through page after page, the journal describing a house, my house, and the horrors that had occurred within its walls. The entries were written by someone who had been trapped here just like me, someone who had tried to leave but was always pulled back. The journal spoke of a presence that lived inside the house, something ancient, something that fed on fear. My hands shook as I read. The entries were more disturbing the longer I looked at them. The writer described hearing whispers at night, seeing figures in the shadows, feeling the walls close in. And then, the last entry sent a chill down my spine. "I've seen it. The thing that watches, it's waiting for you. It always comes back." I dropped the journal, my heart racing. I couldn't breathe. This couldn't be real, could it? I turned quickly, my eyes searching the room for any other clues. But before I could take another step, the phone rang again. The noise sliced through the air like a knife, sharp and insistent. I froze, my body tense, every muscle in my being screaming for me to run. But I couldn't. I had to answer it. I had to find out what it wanted. I rushed out of the study and down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. The phone was on the counter just like before. The same old phone, the same dark screen. I grabbed it with shaking hands, my heart thundering in my chest. The caller ID was blocked, again. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" My voice sounded foreign to me, thin and weak. The line was silent for a long moment. I could feel the tension building, the weight of the silence pressing in on me. Then the voice came, low, soft, familiar. "James." My blood ran cold. It was the same voice as before, the voice I had heard over and over in my nightmares. "I'm inside," it whispered. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I looked around frantically, my pulse racing. The house felt smaller now, suffocating. Something was here with me, something that had been here all along. The phone in my hand felt like a weight I couldn't escape. I was suffocating, drowning in the silence that hung heavy in the air. My heart beat wildly against my chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the erratic thoughts racing through my mind. The voice, that voice, had haunted me for days, but now, hearing it in person, it was worse than anything I could have imagined. "I'm inside," it had whispered. The words echoed in my ears, a constant reminder of the nightmare I had become trapped in. I looked around the room, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner, but there was nothing. No one. The house was still, unnervingly so, the kind of stillness that sent a chill crawling up your spine. I thought I saw something move in the corner of my vision, but when I turned, it was gone. "Focus, James, focus." I needed to find out what was happening. I couldn't keep running forever. The house had become a labyrinth, a prison where the walls seemed to close in on me more with each passing second. I had to confront whatever this was, whatever had been watching me, tormenting me. I steadied my breath, my finger hovering over the receiver. I needed answers. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady, though it trembled with fear. The voice chuckled softly, the sound sending shivers down my spine. "You know who I am, you've always known." I felt my knees weaken, my stomach turning in knots. There was only one person who could say that, one person who had been with me, watching me, for as long as I could remember. Dad. But it couldn't be him. No, he was gone. He had died years ago. The voice on the other end continued, its tone almost mocking. "You're finally starting to understand all of this. It's because of you. You've been bringing me back with every fear you fed me. I've always been here waiting." My breath caught in my throat. I had heard the stories, the rumors, but I never thought it would be true. I had thought my family was cursed, that something dark had been tied to this house long before we moved in. But the truth was far more terrifying. The house itself wasn't the source of the evil. No, it was me. I had brought it here. I remembered my father's stories about the house, how it had a way of drawing in people like us, people with certain qualities, people who had the ability to see the world through a darker lens, to see things others couldn't, people like him, people like me. "You've always known, James," the voice repeated, the words like poison in my ear. "All it takes is a little fear, a little doubt, and I'm here. I'll always be here." I could hear it now, the eerie truth settling in my bones like ice. The caller wasn't just a voice on the other end of the line. It was something much darker, something ancient. It had been with me all along, watching, waiting for the moment when I'd unlock the door to it. I staggered backward, the phone slipping from my hand and crashing to the floor with a sharp thud. The house felt alive now, the walls pressing in closer with every breath I took. I had made a terrible mistake. I had opened the door to something that would never let me go. I turned and bolted for the front door, my mind only focused on escaping. My hand grasped the doorknob, turning it, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Panicking, I pulled harder, my heart racing faster as I yanked the door. Nothing. It was as if the house itself was holding me captive, unwilling to let me leave. "Why won't you just leave me alone?" I screamed at the walls, my voice breaking under the strain. From behind me, I heard a soft, whispering laugh. "You're not leaving, James," the voice murmured. "You're mine now." The realization hit me with full force. I had never been meant to escape. The house wasn't just a prison. It was a trap, and I had walked right into it, feeding it with my fears, my confusion, my doubts. There was no running anymore, no place I could hide. The house had claimed me, and in doing so, it had claimed my soul. I turned, eyes wild and my breath shallow. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, growing darker, more tangible. They reached toward me, wrapping around my body like hands pulling me in. I fought against them, but the more I struggled, the tighter their grip became. I stumbled back, trying to make sense of everything, but it was too late. The air grew thick, oppressive, and the house seemed to close in around me, its walls vibrating with a low, guttural hum. "You can't escape, James. You never could," the voice said, now clearer than ever. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by a feeling of crushing dread. My father's stories had been true, and now it was my turn to become part of the house's dark legacy. The shadows engulfed me completely. The last thing I heard was the voice, whispering one final sentence. "Welcome home, James." Story number 2, The Intruder Who Never Left. It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. The sun was still high in the sky, the golden light filtering through the windows of my small apartment. The warmth of the sun made the room feel cozy, almost inviting. My name is James, and I'm 27 years old. I live alone in a modest apartment in the city, a space I've come to call my own over the past few years. My job as a freelance graphic designer keeps me busy, though I often find myself working from home to escape the hustle and bustle of the office. Being alone doesn't bother me, honestly, I prefer it. My family lives in a different state, and the few friends I have are spread out across the country. It's peaceful here. Quiet. Just the way I like it. I was sitting at my desk, trying to wrap up the latest project I'd been working on for the past few days. My computer screen flickered, and I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to shake off the feeling that I was missing something. I'd been staring at my design for hours, and the colors were starting to blur together. My mind wandered as I took a sip from my coffee mug. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, grounding me as I leaned back in my chair. That's when I heard it, the knock. Soft, deliberate, it was coming from the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. No packages, no deliveries, just the usual quiet afternoon. My phone hadn't gone off with any notifications. I hadn't ordered anything recently. But there it was again, a soft rap on the door. It was enough to pull me out of my thoughts and break the calm of the room. I stood up slowly. Maybe it was a mistake. Perhaps a neighbor had dropped by to borrow something, or maybe a delivery person had arrived unexpectedly. It wouldn't be the first time someone had left a package at my door when I wasn't home. Still, something about the knock didn't sit right with me. It was too quiet, too soft, like someone didn't want to be heard. I walked cautiously to the door, peering through the peephole. The hallway outside looked empty. There was no one standing there, no sign of a delivery person. I opened the door, stepping out into the quiet corridor of the building. To my surprise, there was a small, plain cardboard box sitting directly in front of my door. No note, no label, just a box. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. I glanced around, expecting to see someone hiding around the corner or a delivery person waiting, but the hallway remained still and silent. The box sat there, as if waiting for me to pick it up. I bent down and grabbed it. The box felt surprisingly light in my hands, almost too light to contain anything of value. There was no indication of where it had come from or who had left it. It didn't even have the usual tracking information or shipping labels you'd expect from a package. Confused, I brought the box inside and set it down on the kitchen counter. I examined it more closely, turning it over in my hands. There was no obvious reason why it should be sitting there. The cardboard was smooth, without any wrinkles or signs of wear. It looked brand new. I ran my fingers along the edges, trying to find any markings or clues about where it had come from, but there was nothing. With a growing sense of unease, I grabbed a knife from the drawer and carefully sliced through the tape. I opened the top of the box, the cardboard tearing with a soft rip. As I lifted the flaps, my heart skipped a beat. Inside was something wrapped in several layers of bubble wrap. I hesitated before unwrapping it, not sure what to expect. The object inside didn't make a sound when I shook the box, which only added to the mystery. It was light, too light for something that seemed so solid. As I peeled away the layers of bubble wrap, my breath caught in my throat. What I found was unexpected, no ordinary package, no item I would have ever ordered. It was a small, intricately carved wooden figure. It was of a man. Well, not quite a man. The figure's features were distorted, exaggerated. His eyes were hollow, empty voids, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. His body was contorted, unnaturally bent at the waist, as though it had been sculpted in a way that defied natural form. I couldn't help but stare at it, my mind racing. Why would someone send this to me? I didn't recognize the carving or the style. It wasn't anything I'd seen before, nor would I have ever bought something like it. It was unsettling. The figure looked ancient, as though it had been carved decades ago, but the craftsmanship was too precise, too detailed to be an old artifact. I turned it over in my hands, hoping to find some sort of clue, anything that would explain this strange delivery. And then, as I looked at the back of the figure, I noticed something. A single word had been carved into the wood, etched deeply into the surface. Run. I froze, my fingers still clutching the figure. My heart pounded in my chest and my breath quickened. The room suddenly felt colder, and the weight of the object in my hand seemed to grow heavier by the second. The word was clear, too clear to be a mistake. Run. What was I supposed to make of this? Before I could even process what I had just read, my phone rang. The sudden sound made me jump, nearly dropping the carving onto the floor. I grabbed the phone quickly, trying to steady my nerves. "Hello," I said, my voice shaky, unsure of what I was about to hear. There was a long pause on the other end, the silence almost suffocating. And then, in a low, distorted voice, I heard the words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "Don't trust the package, don't trust anyone, they're watching." The line went dead. I stood frozen in place, still holding the phone to my ear, but there was nothing, no more voice, no sound at all. I lowered the phone, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? Who was watching me? And who sent this strange, ominous figure? I glanced around the room, suddenly feeling very aware of the silence. The weight of the carving in my hands felt heavier now, almost as if it had a presence of its own. It was as though the room had changed, shifted somehow. I stood there frozen, phone still pressed against my ear, the unsettling words from the mysterious caller lingering in my mind. "Don't trust the package. Don't trust anyone. They're watching." The voice had been warped, unnatural, as though the person on the other end was trying to disguise it. It was chilling, a tone that sent an icy shiver down my spine, leaving me with an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. Who was that? Why had they contacted me, and more importantly, why did it feel like something larger was at play? I hung up the phone quickly, my pulse racing in my ears. My fingers trembled as I set the phone down on the kitchen counter. The figure, the wooden object resting in front of me, seemed to watch me. Its unblinking eyes, carved so perfectly into the wood, felt like they were following my every movement, like the gaze of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "Run," the word scratched into the back of the carving. It was as if it had been burned there, warning me of something sinister that I couldn't yet comprehend. The message seemed too direct, too real to ignore. I stepped back, glancing around the kitchen, feeling a suffocating presence that wasn't there before. The kitchen, which had always been comforting with its vintage appliances and neatly organized shelves, now felt like a scene from a nightmare. Every little sound, the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the hum of the refrigerator, felt amplified, as if the world had slowed down around me. I couldn't stay there. The air felt too thick, as though every breath I took was weighed down by the tension of 1,000 unseen eyes. I grabbed the wooden figure and placed it on the counter with deliberate care, avoiding touching it any longer than necessary. There was something about it, something so off-putting. A chill had settled into my bones, as though the very object was cursed. But what was I supposed to do about it? Who could I even tell? My first instinct was to call my mother, but I couldn't. She worked long hours at the hospital, and I didn't want to worry her about something I couldn't even explain. Besides, she wouldn't pick up the phone anyway, so I set the thought aside and began pacing the room, my mind racing. I needed to get out of the apartment, away from that thing, away from whatever invisible force was making my skin crawl. The apartment had always been my safe space. It was small but cozy, filled with personal touches. my favorite book stacked on the shelf, a collection of old vinyl records, a picture of my family hanging on the wall. Now it felt like a cage and I was its prisoner. I grabbed my jacket, hoping the simple act of stepping outside would clear my mind. A breath of fresh air, a walk, anything to reset my thoughts. I needed to focus on something other than the mystery of the package and its ominous warning. I headed out the door, locking it behind me. The hallway of the apartment building was dimly lit, and the echo of my footsteps seemed louder than usual. Every time I passed a door, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the other side. Was I just paranoid? Or was the world truly different now that I had received that package? Outside, the world felt almost too normal. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the city streets. People went about their day as if nothing was wrong, as if everything was in its place. But I couldn't shake the gnawing unease that had lodged itself in my chest. The atmosphere felt like a thin veil, fragile and easily torn. Something wasn't right. I needed answers. I needed to find out what this was all about. But how? Who could I trust? The park was nearby, just a few blocks away, and I made my way there, hoping the natural surroundings might help calm me down. The park was my usual escape, a place I went when I needed to think. I walked along the winding paths, the scent of pine trees and freshly cut grass hanging in the air. The peaceful sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the breeze should have relaxed me, but instead, they seemed to highlight the growing anxiety I was feeling. Every step I took felt heavier, as though the weight of the situation was pressing down on me from every direction. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the small details, the way the sunlight danced across the water in the park's pond, the soft crunch of the gravel underfoot, the distant laughter of children playing. But no matter how much I tried to lose myself in the moment, I couldn't stop thinking about the package, the carving, and the strange warning. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, deciding to call my mother again. Maybe she'd be free now, and I could explain everything, even if I wasn't sure how to put it into words. But when I glanced at the screen, I saw no new messages, and the call went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, I tried again. No answer. The silence felt deafening, more oppressive than the absence of a reply. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as I waited for a response that never came. It was then that I noticed it. An unfamiliar number had appeared in my texts. I clicked on the message with a sense of trepidation, half expecting it to be another warning. But this was different. The text read, "They're still watching. Don't go back to your apartment. Run." My heart skipped a beat. It was the same warning from before, the same voice that had called earlier. Only this time, it felt even more real, like the words were directed at me personally, like they knew exactly where I was and what I was thinking. I looked around the park, trying to see if anyone seemed out of place. But the park was still filled with the same people, joggers, families walking their dogs, and children playing on the swings. No one looked suspicious, yet the message made everything feel wrong. The world had shifted, and I was no longer sure who I could trust. My mind raced. Should I listen to the message? Should I run? Or was this some elaborate prank? I wasn't sure, but I didn't want to find out the hard way. I turned and started walking back toward the exit, my steps quickening. But the park seemed to stretch on forever, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step. When I finally reached the street, I didn't know what to do. I hailed a cab, my hands shaking as I opened the door. I climbed inside, hoping the drive would clear my head. But the ride felt strange. The streets that had once seemed so familiar now looked different, distorted, as if they too were part of a dream I couldn't wake up from. As we neared my apartment building, the knot in my stomach tightened. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking straight into a trap. I paid the driver quickly, almost running up the steps to the building. The hallway was eerily quiet. No neighbors were in sight. I fumbled for my keys, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached my door, I felt a brief sense of relief. It was locked. It was safe. But when I stepped inside, I froze. Something was wrong. The figure, the carved wooden object, was gone. The silence in my apartment was deafening as I stood frozen in the doorway. My eyes scanned the living room, hoping for some sense of normalcy, but the sight that greeted me was anything but. The wooden figure, the one that had unnerved me ever since it arrived, was gone. I couldn't believe it at first. It had been right there on the counter, staring at me with those eerie, unblinking eyes. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me with a soft click. My heart was pounding, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the strange, ominous feeling that had plagued me all day returned with full force. The room, once a place of comfort, now felt cold and foreign. I scanned the space looking for anything out of place. My gaze fell on the counter where the figure had been. There was no sign of it, no trace of any disturbance. The surface was clean as if nothing had ever been there. I approached cautiously, half expecting it to appear again, but there was nothing. Just the same dull clutter of daily life. A bowl of fruit, a stack of dishes waiting to be washed, the half-empty cup of coffee I had left earlier. I walked further into the room, my footsteps echoing loudly in the quiet apartment. My eyes flicked to the corner where I kept my coat, but nothing seemed unusual. The apartment was eerily still, the kind of silence that made your skin prickle. Every little sound, every creak of the floorboards underfoot, felt amplified, like the very walls were closing in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My mind raced with thoughts of who could have taken it, why they would do such a thing, and what it meant. The wooden figure had been part of the delivery. It was the only thing I had received in that package, but now it was gone, and I had no explanation for it. I forced myself to calm down, taking deep breaths as I walked over to the window. The city outside looked the same as it always did. The hustle and bustle of the streets, the distant hum of traffic, people going about their lives. But even the sight of it couldn't put my mind at ease. If anything, the normality of the scene felt like a cruel contrast to the chaos that was brewing inside me. The questions kept piling up one after another like an insurmountable mountain. Who had taken the figure? Had it ever really been there? Had I imagined it? No, I couldn't have. I remembered so clearly how it had looked, how it had seemed to watch me. But now, the more I thought about it, the more unsure I became. Was I losing my grip on reality? I turned away from the window, desperate to find some answer, some clue to explain what was happening. I spotted my phone on the counter where I had left it, and I snatched it up quickly. My fingers were shaking as I unlocked it, eager to check if there were any new messages, anything that might give me some direction. As soon as I opened my texts, I saw it, a message from an unknown number. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat as I read the message. "It's gone, they took it, they're coming for you." I froze, my pulse quickened as the words hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone knew about the figure. Someone knew exactly what had happened. I hadn't told anyone about it, not my friends, not my family. How could they possibly know? Was this just another prank? Or was there something more sinister at play? I quickly typed a response, my fingers fumbling as I tried to keep my composure. "Who is this? What do you mean they took it?" I stared at the screen, waiting for a reply. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. I glanced around the room again, half expecting someone to appear in the doorway. The walls seemed to press in closer with every passing moment. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap, the walls closing in around me with each unanswered message. Minutes passed, and still there was no reply. I set the phone down, feeling a sense of growing dread settle over me. I had to figure out what was going on. I couldn't just sit here and wait for whatever was coming next. My thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door, a sharp, sudden sound that made me jump. My heart leaped into my throat. Who could that be? I hadn't ordered anything else, and I certainly hadn't invited anyone over. I glanced at the peephole cautiously, trying to see who was on the other side. The hallway outside was empty. The knock came again, louder this time. I hesitated, my mind racing. It was probably just a neighbor, right? Or perhaps a delivery, though I couldn't imagine what else could possibly arrive after the package from earlier. But something about it felt off. The urgency in the knock, the way it echoed through the apartment, felt different. This wasn't just a casual visit. I backed away from the door slowly, trying not to make a sound. My pulse was racing, and my palms were sweaty as I considered my options. Should I open the door, or should I ignore it and hope it would go away? but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me again. It was the same sensation I had felt when I first received the package, the unease that gnawed at the edges of my mind. Something was wrong, and I needed to figure out what it was before it was too late. I crept back to the door, peering through the peephole once more. Still, nothing. But the sound of the knock echoed in my ears, and the tension in the air seemed to thicken. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I unlocked the door slowly, pulling it open just a crack enough to peek outside. But there was no one there. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped into the hallway, my eyes scanning the empty space. The fluorescent lights flickered above me, casting strange shadows on the walls. Everything looked so ordinary, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. And then I heard it, a rustling sound coming from the far end of the hallway. It was faint at first, barely audible, but then it grew louder. I squinted, trying to make out the source, but all I could see was the dimly lit corridor stretching out before me. I backed into my apartment, my hands shaking as I slammed the door shut behind me. My mind was spinning. What was happening? Who was messing with me? I needed answers, but more than that, I needed to make sure I was safe. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had taken root in my chest. The hallway outside my apartment was empty, but I knew something wasn't right. The knock, the rustling sound, everything about it felt off. It wasn't just a random occurrence. No, this felt intentional, like someone or something was toying with me. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I walked back to the center of the room, the silence pressing down on me, suffocating me with its weight. My heart beat louder than it should have, thudding in my ears with every step I took. I needed to think. I needed to figure out what was happening before it escalated further. I glanced at my phone again, half expecting another message, but there was nothing. I had already checked, but the screen remained dark and lifeless. The message from the unknown number haunted me, repeating itself over and over in my mind. "It's gone. They took it. They're coming for you." I hadn't told anyone about the figure, so how could this person know? What did they mean by "they're coming"? Who were they? My head spun with questions, each one leading to more confusion. I walked over to the kitchen counter and grabbed the empty coffee mug I had left there earlier, cradling it in my hands. I needed something to calm my nerves, but the mug felt oddly heavy in my hands, as if it were made of lead, and it only served to remind me of how trapped I felt in this apartment. The place where I once felt safe now felt like a cage. I tried to breathe deeply, reminding myself that I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just a coincidence, someone at the door, a harmless prank, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. No, this wasn't normal. Something was happening, and it wasn't just the mysterious figure anymore. Something darker was at play, and I had no idea what it was. I set the mug down on the counter with a clink, my thoughts racing. I couldn't sit here and wait for something to happen. I had to take control of the situation, figure out what was going on before it spiraled out of control. I stood up and paced around the room, trying to shake off the sense of dread that lingered in the air. But no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't go away. The room felt different, like it had been altered somehow. The shadows seemed longer, the corners darker, and the atmosphere suffocating. I walked to the window and peered outside, hoping for some sign of normalcy. The city was as bustling as always, cars honking, people walking along the sidewalks, life carrying on as usual. But it all felt distant, like I was looking at a world that no longer belonged to me. The outside world felt like an illusion, a place I couldn't reach. I didn't belong there anymore, not with what was happening to me. I pulled away from the window and turned back to the room, scanning the space once again. I checked the door, the window, the closet, the bathroom, every nook and cranny. I felt like I was losing my mind, but I needed to be sure. I needed to make sure no one was hiding in the shadows, watching me. I walked down the hallway, trying to push away the sense of paranoia creeping in. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and the lights overhead flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I felt like I was being followed, though when I looked behind me, there was nothing there. I reached the closet and opened it, quickly scanning the contents. Nothing seemed out of place. My clothes hung neatly on hangers, and there was no sign of disturbance. But why did it feel like I wasn't alone? Why did it feel like something or someone was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike? I quickly shut the closet door and retreated back to the living room where I felt a little safer, a little more in control. My phone was still silent. No new messages, but I couldn't shake the sense of impending danger. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light felt like a warning. Then suddenly I heard a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, like a faint scraping noise coming from the far corner of the room. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was as if the walls themselves were whispering to me, urging me to pay attention. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning every inch of the room, but I couldn't see anything. The sound came again, this time louder, more distinct. It was coming from the kitchen, near the counter where the figure had once been. I stood frozen in place, my breath shallow, my pulse quickening. The air felt thick, and every second seemed to stretch on forever as I waited for whatever it was to reveal itself. I slowly approached the kitchen, moving cautiously, my mind racing. What if the figure was back? What if someone had broken in? I had to be ready for anything. I stepped into the kitchen, my eyes darting around. The room was still, the only sound being the faint hum of the refrigerator. I walked to the counter, my fingers brushing the surface as I leaned over to inspect it more closely. The figure was still gone, but the faint scraping sound persisted. It wasn't coming from the counter anymore. It was coming from beneath it. My heart raced as I crouched down to get a better look. The noise was unmistakable now, like something, or someone, was scraping against the floor beneath the kitchen cabinets. I reached for the cabinet doors and pulled them open, my hands trembling with anticipation. There, hidden in the shadows beneath the cabinet, was something I hadn't seen before. A small, dark object. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for it, my fingers brushing against something cold and smooth. I pulled it out, and as the object came into the light, my blood ran cold. It was the wooden figure, the same one that had been missing earlier. But how had it gotten there? The words on the paper lingered in my mind, echoing through my thoughts like a chant. It's not over yet. You haven't seen the worst of it. Every time I tried to dismiss them, they came back stronger, more insistent. The air in my apartment felt suffocating now, and I couldn't stand the silence that pressed in from every corner. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong from the moment I found that figure. I tried to shake it off. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I needed a plan. I couldn't keep reacting to every new terror without thinking. I was smarter than this. I would figure it out. I would face whatever was in my apartment. But as I stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the figure, silent, still, and unsettlingly familiar, my phone buzzed in my pocket, jerking me out of my thoughts. I pulled it out, already knowing who it would be. There was only one person who'd been reaching out to me all day. It was my best friend, Jake. I quickly tapped the screen to open the message. "Hey man, you okay? I've been trying to call. You've been acting weird. Call me when you get a chance." I stared at the message for a moment. His words were kind, but they only made the fear inside me twist tighter. Jake had been the one to keep me grounded for years, the one I could talk to about anything. But he didn't know what I was dealing with. I couldn't explain this to him, not without sounding insane. I didn't have time to respond, though, because my phone buzzed again, this time with a call from him. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I couldn't ignore it, but I didn't know how I could talk to him without everything spilling out. Without telling him about the figurine, the note, or the feeling that I wasn't alone in this apartment anymore. The phone rang for a few seconds longer, and I hesitated, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. What was I supposed to say? How could I explain what was happening without sounding completely unhinged? The thought of talking about the strange occurrences was terrifying in itself. What if he didn't believe me? What if this was all just my mind playing tricks on me? I answered. "Jake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady but failing. It came out shaky, nervous. "Hey man, you sound off," Jake said, his voice full of concern. "What's going on? I've been trying to reach you. You've been MIA all day. Something happened." I swallowed hard, trying to force words out. "Yeah, I don't know, it's just things are weird here." "Things? What do you mean weird?" he asked, his voice growing more insistent. "Is everything okay? I'm coming over if you don't answer me straight." No, don't come over," I said quickly, a sense of panic rising in my chest. I'm fine. I just need to figure things out, okay? Jake was silent for a moment, clearly not convinced. What do you mean you're fine? You're scaring me, man. You're acting like you're in trouble. The words hit me harder than I expected. I didn't want to scare him. I didn't want anyone to know how out of control things were getting. I'm not in trouble, I lied, but even as the words left my mouth, they didn't feel true. I wasn't fine. I didn't feel safe, and I certainly didn't feel in control of anything anymore. Just give me a little time. I'll call you when I can, all right? Jake's tone softened, but I could still hear the worry in it. All right, man, but don't shut me out. You've been acting strange for a while now. You know I'm here if you need anything, right? Yeah, I said, though it didn't feel real. I know, thanks, Jake. I ended the call before I could say anything else. His concern lingered in my mind, adding another layer of weight to the already heavy situation. But there wasn't time for me to dwell on it. I had to stay focused. I looked back at the figurine on the kitchen counter. It seemed to mock me now, its empty eyes staring back, its wooden form seeming to pulse with some kind of unseen energy. It was as if it knew something I didn't, knew something I couldn't understand. My stomach churned as I thought about the note again. It's not over yet. You haven't seen the worst of it. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had left it behind wasn't done with me. They were just getting started. The silence in the apartment felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, and I could almost hear the quiet whisper of something or someone waiting just out of sight. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow moving in the hallway, but nothing, only the stillness that I could no longer ignore. I needed answers. I needed to get to the bottom of this before it consumed me. There had to be a reason behind the figurine, behind the note, behind the strange feeling that had crept into every corner of my life. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I knew. All I had was the message, the ominous warning, and the strange object that now felt like a ticking time bomb. But I wasn't about to let fear control me. Not again. I had to take action, but where would I even start? A sudden gust of wind howled through the apartment, rattling the windows as if to answer me. The lights flickered. For a brief moment, I thought I saw the shadows dance in the corner of my eye. I whirled around, but again, nothing. I grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair and headed toward the door. I needed to leave, get out of the apartment. But where would I go? Who could I trust? There was a creeping feeling that I couldn't shake, like I was walking into the lion's den, no matter which way I turned. The door felt heavy in my hand as I pushed it open, but I had no other choice. I wasn't going to sit there waiting for whatever was coming next. I wasn't going to be a victim, not without a fight. I stepped out into the hallway, the sound of the door shutting behind me echoing through the silence. As I made my way down the stairs and into the street, the sense of being watched grew stronger. The air felt colder, and every car that passed seemed to move too slowly, as if they were keeping an eye on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the game had already begun, and there was no turning back now. The words on the paper were more than just a warning, they were a prophecy, and I was about to face whatever horrors came with it. I walked briskly down the street, my breath coming out in shallow bursts as the air grew colder with each passing minute. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the still night, but every now and then I thought I could hear something else behind me, an extra set of footsteps, just out of sync with my own. I spun around a few times expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. The street was empty, the only sounds being the wind and the distant hum of traffic. But that sensation, the feeling of being watched, clung to me like a second skin. I couldn't shake it off. It wasn't just the apartment. It wasn't just the figurine or the note or the strange events from the past couple of days. Something was wrong. Something was following me, and I had no idea who or what it was. I kept walking, trying to focus on putting as much distance between myself and the apartment as possible. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Jake. I pulled it out of my pocket and stared at the screen. His message read, "Where are you? Are you okay?" I could feel the guilt rising in my chest. I knew I should have been honest with him. He was my best friend and he deserved to know what was happening to me. But I couldn't tell him. Not yet. not when everything felt like it was on the verge of spiraling out of control. I shoved the phone back into my pocket, not ready to talk yet. I needed space, time to think, time to figure out what the hell was going on. As I walked further, I found myself nearing a park, a place I used to visit when I was younger before things started to change. The park was dark now, the path barely illuminated by the flickering streetlights. The silence seemed unnaturally thick here, as if even the trees were holding their breath. I stopped at the edge of the park, staring into the shadows, feeling a strange pull to go in. Something told me that whatever was happening to me, whatever force had started this nightmare, was connected to this place, to the apartment, to the figurine. The more I thought about it, the more it all felt like it was building to something bigger, something I wasn't seeing yet. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the park path, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. The air felt different here, heavier, colder. I kept walking, the unease gnawing at me with every step. Every time I glanced around, the shadows seemed to shift, like they were watching me. There was something in the air, something invisible but undeniable, a presence. I reached the middle of the park, the trees towering around me like silent sentinels. That's when I heard it. A faint sound at first, barely noticeable, but then it grew louder. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching in the gravel. Not behind me this time they were in front of me. My heart raced as I stopped dead in my tracks, my eyes scanning the darkness ahead. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound kept coming closer, getting louder with each passing second. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my pulse quickening. I wasn't alone. I took a step back, my feet moving without thought, my mind screaming at me to get out of there. The footsteps continued, now unmistakably close, too close. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, everything went quiet. The footsteps stopped, leaving only the heavy silence behind. I stood there frozen, trying to listen for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No sound, no rustling of leaves, no footsteps, just an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I wasn't alone. I took another step back, my eyes darting to the trees around me. There was nothing, no figure, no shadow, just the night. But the sense of dread that had settled over me deepened, thickened. I was being watched. I could feel it. I turned quickly, my mind screaming at me to leave, but my legs refused to cooperate. I had to get out of the park. I had to. A voice broke the silence, a low whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't a word, but a sound, almost like a growl or a hiss. It came from the direction of the trees, but when I turned, I saw nothing. "James," the voice whispered again, just loud enough for me to hear. My name, twisted and wrong, carried an unmistakable menace. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My name, but no one was there. The whisper came again, closer this time. And then from the darkness, a figure stepped into view. A shadow, vague and indistinct, moving with a strange, unnatural fluidity. It was tall, too tall. Its outline blurred, like a shadow that didn't belong in the world of light and darkness. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its eyes on me. The weight of its gaze pressed down on me, and I knew instinctively that it wasn't human. "James," it whispered again, the voice sounding almost pleased, like it was savoring my fear. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real, but it felt real. It felt like something far worse than I could imagine. The shadow moved closer, the air growing colder as it did. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the gravel, my heart pounding against my ribs. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if it was following me. I just needed to get out of there. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always one step behind me. And with every step I took, the whisper of my name grew louder. I couldn't run fast enough. My lungs burned and my legs ached as I sprinted through the park, the gravel path now a blur beneath my feet. The only thing I could focus on was the sound of that whisper, my name, curling through the air like a threat. The figure in the distance hadn't moved yet, but I could feel it, as though it was closing in, a constant presence just out of sight. Every time I glanced behind me, I expected to see it there, its shadow stretching across the path, following me at a distance. But there was nothing. The park was empty, the trees nothing more than dark silhouettes, the faint light from the street lamps casting long shadows over the ground. But the feeling of being hunted, of being watched, was unshakable. I turned a corner sharply, hoping to lose whatever was following me. The air seemed to grow colder with every step, the night pressing in on me, tightening around me like a vice. My breath came in ragged bursts, the fog of it hanging in the cold night air. I was almost to the exit, the familiar streetlight in sight, when I heard it again. The whisper. "James." It was right behind me this time. I whipped around, heart racing, pulse thundering in my ears. There was nothing there, no figure, no shadow, just the emptiness of the park stretching on into the distance. I was losing my mind. There had to be some rational explanation for this, right? Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just too stressed, too exhausted. But the cold dread that clawed at my insides told me otherwise. I forced myself to keep running, ignoring the ache in my muscles, the way my body screamed for me to stop. I just needed to make it out of the park. Once I was out, once I was back in the safety of the familiar world outside, I would be fine. But as I reached the edge of the park, where the streetlight bathed the sidewalk in pale yellow light, I froze. The air seemed to shift, like something was moving just beyond my peripheral vision. I couldn't tell if it was the shadow of a tree or something else entirely. My breath caught in my throat, and for a brief moment I hesitated. And then I heard it again, a rustling in the leaves behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slowly at first, then faster, closing in on me with each passing second. I whipped around, my heart hammering, and saw nothing. Just the darkness of the park behind me, the faint outline of trees and bushes, but no one there. I was losing it. I had to be. It wasn't possible that I was hearing footsteps if no one was there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I took a few steps forward, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that crawled up my spine. The footsteps continued, though, in the same pattern as before, closer now and faster. I broke into a full sprint, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced down the street, my feet pounding the pavement. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just had to get home. The streets were empty, the houses dark, the occasional car passing by in the distance. My breath came in ragged gasps, each inhalation a sharp reminder of how much I had been running. I turned onto my block, relief flooding through me as I saw my apartment building at the end of the street. I was almost there, almost safe. But as I neared the entrance, something made me stop dead in my tracks. There, standing at the door to my apartment building, was a figure, a shadow, indistinct but tall, too tall. It was standing perfectly still, as though waiting for me. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, pressing down on me like a weight. "James." The voice was a whisper again, but this time it wasn't in the wind. It came from the figure. The shadow seemed to shift slightly, as if it were trying to reach out to me. My heart skipped a beat, and I couldn't bring myself to take another step. I was paralyzed, caught between the desire to flee and the instinct to confront whatever was tormenting me. But I couldn't stay here, not with it so close. I turned on my heel, not caring if I looked crazy. I ran as fast as I could down the street, hearing the footsteps behind me once again. This time they were louder, closer. It was following me. I wasn't going to make it home, not like this. I couldn't outrun it, but I had to try. There was no other choice. The footsteps grew louder, faster, and I knew it was right behind me. I dared to look over my shoulder just for a second, and for the briefest moment I saw the figure in the corner of my eye, its outline sharp against the darkness. Its face was a blur, its eyes dark and unblinking, but I could feel them on me, burning through me like a searing heat. I snapped my head back forward and pushed myself harder, the fear now coursing through my veins like ice. There was no escaping it. It wasn't just following me, it was getting closer, gaining on me with every step. I could hear its breath now, low, raspy, like it was savoring the chase. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. There was only one thought, one instinct in my mind: run. I turned another corner, desperate to get away, but the footsteps didn't falter. They continued, relentless, and I knew deep down that it wasn't just behind me anymore. It was everywhere. I rounded another corner, my legs screaming in protest, but I couldn't stop. My mind was a blur of panic, and I could feel the weight of someone closing in on me. I didn't dare look back this time. I could hear it, though, the faint shuffle of footsteps, like they were always there, just behind me but not close enough to reach out and grab me. The city around me was empty, the streets eerily silent aside from my own breath and the sound of the footsteps stalking me. It was like I was alone in the world, with only the shadow at my back to keep me company. The terror clawed at my chest, tightening with each step. Every instinct screamed at me to run faster, but my body felt like it was moving through thick mud, my energy drained, my muscles stiff with exhaustion. I reached the next intersection, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting strange, dancing shadows along the pavement. But it didn't matter how fast I ran, how many turns I took. I couldn't outrun the fear, couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. Then in the distance I saw it, a flicker of light, a house, a place to hide. The sudden hope that I could lose whatever was following me surged in my chest, and I pushed myself harder, nearly stumbling with the effort. I didn't dare slow down as I neared the house. My feet pounded against the pavement, but every step felt heavier, like the ground was pulling me back. The house grew closer, but it didn't feel like safety. It felt like another trap. I reached the front gate and threw it open, rushing up the path to the door. My hands shook as I grabbed the doorknob, but to my shock, the door was already open. A cold gust of wind swept through the entryway, and the air inside was so still it felt wrong. My skin prickled with unease. It was quiet, too quiet. I didn't know what I expected to find when I stepped inside, but the house was empty. The silence pressed in on me, thick and suffocating like a living thing. I stepped further inside, the hardwood floors creaking under my weight, and the door swung shut behind me with an ominous thud. The house seemed to have a life of its own, each room holding its breath, waiting. I didn't want to stay here, didn't want to risk being cornered, but it felt like my only option. My eyes darted around the darkened living room, looking for anything that might offer some kind of protection. A weapon, a light, anything to keep the terror at bay. But there was nothing. I crept forward, my footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The air was thick with dust and old memories, the faint smell of stale wood and something else, something metallic, like blood. I tried to dismiss the thought, but the sensation of being watched never left me. I needed to find a way out. I needed to figure out what was going on and why I couldn't escape it. The house didn't feel safe, but I had no choice. I moved cautiously from room to room, the shadows seeming to shift just beyond my vision. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stood, motionless. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was as if my body refused to acknowledge it, couldn't believe it was there. The figure was tall, its outline dark against the faint light that filtered through the windows. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence. Its silence was deafening. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, but my legs refused to move. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the figure. It was like it was waiting for me to make the first move, to give it permission to act. But I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready for whatever this thing was to come closer. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off it. My body screamed at me to leave, to get out of this house, but the door was still open behind me, and I couldn't turn my back on the figure in front of me. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was wrong, that something terrible was about to happen. The figure remained unmoving, its presence like a weight pressing on my chest. It didn't come closer, but it didn't leave either. It was as if the house had become a cage, trapping me inside with this thing. And then the whisper came again, soft but unmistakable. "James." I jerked back, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. It was so close, so personal, like the words were coming from within me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise, my skin crawling with the cold dread that gripped me. The figure remained still, but I could feel it now more than ever, its eyes on me, burning through me as if it knew everything about me. I didn't want to stay, I couldn't stay, but my legs were frozen in place, my body refusing to obey. The whisper came again, louder this time, a rasping sound that made my blood run cold. "James, you can't escape." The words hung in the air, thick with menace. It was like a warning, like a challenge, daring me to run, daring me to make the wrong move. But I couldn't move. I was trapped in this house with whatever this thing was, and I didn't know how much longer I could survive. The air around me seemed to tighten, the walls pressing in, suffocating me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The hallway was empty. I stood there, my heart thundering in my chest, every muscle in my body screaming for me to flee. But I didn't move. I couldn't. What if it was still there, waiting? I wasn't sure how long I stood there, just waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing came. The house was silent again, the stillness almost unbearable. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. The only thing I knew was that I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to find a way out, and fast. I was barely able to hold myself together as I stumbled back toward the door. My fingers trembled on the handle, desperately trying to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. The same pressure I had felt when I first entered the house returned, a suffocating force that threatened to crush me. My mind raced. How could this be happening? As my heartbeat quickened, each thump reverberating in my skull. I pulled harder on the door, my nails scraping against the wood. Nothing. It felt as if the house itself had locked me in, trapping me with no escape. A cold sweat drenched my back, and the chill in the air seemed to grow thicker with every passing second. The silence around me was maddening, but it was also a warning, the calm before the storm. And then I heard it again, the whisper. This time it was sharper, more urgent. "James." I froze. This was no longer just a whisper. It was a command, a sinister invitation. It wasn't just a voice I could dismiss as a figment of my imagination. No, this voice had substance. It was real. The weight of it pushed down on me, and the words sank deep into my bones, leaving a cold, gnawing fear in their wake. "You can't run from me." I whipped around, my heart pounding violently in my chest, but the hallway was empty. There was no one. The figure, whatever it had been, was gone. The room felt oppressively still, the air stale, thick with the lingering sensation of being watched. I turned back to the door, but my panic began to mount when I realized something had changed. The handle was now cold to the touch, so cold it burned my hand as I gripped it again. But this time, when I tugged, the door creaked open just slightly, just enough for me to see the dimly lit yard outside. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the door open with all the strength I could muster, ignoring the pain in my limbs, desperate to get out of this place. The wind whipped through the doorway, carrying with it the scent of rain and something foul like decay. I stepped forward, my foot hitting the gravel outside, but as soon as I did, the door slammed shut behind me with an earth-shattering crash. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat, but to my shock, the door was still shut tight. No longer open. The house loomed behind me like a dark sentinel, its windows like empty eyes staring back. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't make sense of what was happening, but I knew one thing. I couldn't go back inside. But as I stood there, frozen, the whisper came once more. "You thought you could leave." My heart dropped into my stomach. I knew the voice now, its tone unmistakable. I had heard it before, each time that dreadful figure had appeared. It wasn't just a trick of the mind, it was alive. It was real. The chill in the air intensified, swirling around me like it was alive too. And that's when I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of the yard, in the shadows cast by the house, something moved. I couldn't make out what it was at first, but the shape was unmistakable. A tall figure, just as before, standing motionless in the darkness. It wasn't a trick of the light. This was the same figure I'd seen earlier, the one I had run from, the one I had thought I had escaped. It stood there, its outline dark against the pale moonlight, and it didn't move. Not even an inch. But I could feel its presence, the weight of it pressing down on me, filling the air with a suffocating dread. I backed away slowly, not daring to take my eyes off the figure. My heart hammered in my chest, and panic clawed at me from all sides. But every step I took, the figure seemed to grow closer, its form slowly emerging from the darkness as though it was drawn toward me. I couldn't stay, I couldn't run, I couldn't think. I turned and ran. The yard blurred around me as I sprinted, my feet pounding the earth beneath me. The gravel crunched loudly, echoing in the night, but I couldn't hear anything else. No footsteps behind me, no sound of pursuit. Yet I could feel it, the ever-present, relentless weight of the figure, watching me, drawing closer. The trees at the edge of the yard blurred past me as I ran down the path. The air was thick and heavy with an oppressive silence, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the sound of my footsteps. I didn't dare look back. I knew better. But then a cold hand gripped my wrist. I was jerked to a halt, the sudden force almost pulling me off my feet. I screamed, trying to break free, but the grip was unyielding. It felt like ice, a cold that went deeper than the surface, into my very bones. My skin prickled with terror as I was spun around, and there, in front of me, was the figure again, now close enough that I could see its features, or lack thereof. Its face was a blur, a shifting mass of shadows and light, as though it were never meant to be seen. Its eyes, if they were eyes, burned with an unnatural glow, empty, hollow, and full of malice. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice a low, guttural rasp that felt like it was coming from the very depths of my soul. I tried to scream, tried to fight, but my body refused to obey. The figure's presence was suffocating, choking the very air from my lungs. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. And then everything went black. Story number 3, The Unseen Visitor. It started with something small, almost insignificant. A noise, barely noticeable at first, like a creak in the floorboards or a distant thud from the next room. I told myself it was nothing. The apartment building I had just moved into was old, really old. The kind of place where the pipes groan and the walls whisper with every shift in the air. At night, the wind seemed to find its way through the cracks in the windows, making the house moan in protest. So a few noises here and there were to be expected, but after a few days, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The noises were getting harder to brush off. I had been living in this small, 2-bedroom apartment for about 3 months. The rent was cheap, and the location couldn't have been better. It was a stone's throw away from work, and I could walk to most places I needed to go. The building itself was a bit rundown, but it was manageable. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the carpet in the hallway had seen better days, but it was home. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was truly on my own. I could make this place my own, set my own rules, and I could finally breathe. At least that's what I thought. My name is James. I'm 24 years old, a recent college grad, and I've always prided myself on being independent. I moved into this apartment to get away from the chaos of my childhood home. No more rules, no more shared spaces, just me and the freedom to do what I wanted. But little did I know that this freedom would come with a price. It was late one evening when I first heard it. The sound was faint, like a soft tapping coming from the kitchen. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the refrigerator was settling or the old pipes shifting beneath the floorboards. But when I got up the next night, there it was again. A soft tap, 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 just out of reach in the corner of the kitchen. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just the house, but my mind kept racing, trying to figure out the source of the sound. I stood up slowly, careful not to make a sound. I felt an odd sense of dread building up in my chest, like something was lurking just out of sight. I took a few cautious steps toward the kitchen, my breath shallow, my eyes scanning every corner. There was nothing there. The kitchen was still. The soft light from the street lamps outside cast long shadows across the floor. It looked peaceful enough. I checked the windows, making sure they were locked, but there was nothing. No signs of forced entry, no strange presence. Yet the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, and went back to bed. But the next night, the noise was there again. It wasn't loud, just that subtle tapping. It was almost like someone was standing in the next room, just out of sight, quietly moving things around. The noise continued for several days, and with each passing night it grew more distinct. I started to hear things that didn't make sense, the sound of something dragging across the floor, the faint rustle of fabric, the shuffle of feet, though I was the only one living in the apartment. I started locking the doors at night, making sure every window was shut tight. Still, the sounds persisted. It felt like someone or something was in the apartment with me. It was one evening after I had come home late from work that I noticed something out of place. I was tired, running on barely any sleep, but there it was. My bedroom door was slightly ajar. I stopped dead in my tracks. I knew I had closed it earlier. I was certain of it. But now it was open by a few inches. My heart raced as I walked cautiously toward the door. There was no sign of anything disturbed in the room. The bed was made, the furniture still in place. Nothing seemed amiss. But the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. I could almost feel eyes on me. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then I saw it, the faintest mark on the floor, a footprint, barely visible but undeniable. It wasn't mine. I hadn't been barefoot and no one had come in without me noticing. I turned on all the lights in the apartment, checking every room, every closet, every corner. But there was no one there. It was as if the apartment had been untouched. The air felt thick with an eerie silence. Yet the door was still open, and that single footprint remained. I went into the living room, pacing in circles. The sounds had gotten worse, and now this. I couldn't make sense of it. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? The tapping noises had stopped for the time being, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. I spent the night sitting up in bed, eyes darting toward the hallway, waiting for the next sound. But nothing came. The next morning I awoke to find the footprint was gone. The floor was clean. The door was still closed as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something or someone was in my apartment, and it wasn't going to leave. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting soft shadows across my living room. I felt exhausted, the kind of tired that settled deep into your bones and refused to leave. The events of last night, if you could even call them events, were too unsettling to just brush off. That feeling of being watched, the unexplained footprints, the eerie silence. It was as if my apartment, my sanctuary, had been invaded by something I couldn't explain. I tried to focus on my routine, tried to push the anxiety down, but the weight of it clung to me no matter what I did. I grabbed my keys, ready to leave for work, but as I stood by the door, my eyes landed on the living room. The window, which I had closed the night before, was slightly ajar. I was sure I hadn't left it open. The cold air from outside trickled in, sending a chill down my spine. My first instinct was to slam it shut, but I paused. I had a feeling, an unshakable feeling, that something had been tampered with. I closed the window with a sharp click, glancing around the room. Everything seemed normal, but nothing felt normal. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the wind had pushed the window open a bit, or maybe I hadn't closed it properly. But I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that something wasn't right. I headed to work, my mind racing. Every little sound, every rustle of the trees outside made me jump. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of them. Was it a prank? Was someone messing with me? But why? And why did it feel so personal? As if whoever or whatever was doing this knew exactly where to strike, when to strike. When I got to the office, I tried to focus on my tasks. I tried to bury myself in the mundane routine of the day, hoping it would help me forget the creeping paranoia that had taken hold of me. But every time my mind wandered, I couldn't shake the thought of my apartment. The empty rooms, the locked doors, the sense of unease that seemed to follow me wherever I went. That night when I returned home, I couldn't bring myself to open the door at first. The fear that had been building inside me all day threatened to overtake me, but I couldn't just stand outside, afraid to go in. This was my home. I had every right to be here. I took a deep breath, turned the handle, and stepped inside. The familiar smell of my apartment hit me first: coffee, dust, the faint scent of old wood. Nothing seemed out of place. The lights were off as I had left them. The windows were closed, locked tight. I was overthinking things. But then I stepped further inside and noticed something. Something small but unmistakable. The living room rug was slightly askew. I frowned, walking over to it. The rug was a bit more out of place than I remembered. It was odd, considering I hadn't been near it all day. My first thought was that I'd moved it in my sleep. Maybe I had gotten up in the night, walked around half asleep, and moved the rug without realizing it. But as I bent down to straighten it, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. A faint, muddy footprint. It was small, too small to be mine, but it was definitely fresh. The soil was still damp and the print was clear. My blood ran cold as I realized what it meant. I wasn't just imagining things. I wasn't losing my mind. Someone had been here. Someone had been in my apartment while I was gone. I scrambled back, my heart racing. I checked the windows again. Locked, the door still secure, but the footprint was real. And the worst part, it was headed straight toward my bedroom. I couldn't think, I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in around me as I stood there, paralyzed with fear. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I almost jumped out of my skin. I pulled it out, heart hammering in my chest. It was Jake again. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain this to him? How could I tell him that someone had been in my apartment, walking around, leaving footprints without me knowing? Instead, I typed out a quick message. I'm fine, just some weird stuff happening. I'll be okay. I hit send and dropped the phone onto the couch. I had to think. I had to figure out what was going on. But the longer I stood there staring at that footprint, the more I realized that I was in over my head. This wasn't some prank. This wasn't just a few strange noises. This was something real, something terrifying, and I didn't know how to stop it. I walked slowly toward the bedroom, trying to steady my breath. The darkness of the hallway seemed to swallow me whole as I stepped toward the door. Every step I took felt like an eternity. My hand hovered over the doorknob, the air thick with dread. With a shaky breath, I turned the handle. The door opened with a soft creak. Nothing, everything was still. The room was dark just as I had left it. The bed was undisturbed, the desk in its usual place. But then I saw it. On the floor near the corner of the room was a single item. A note. It was crumpled, torn at the edges, and it was covered in dirt. I felt my stomach churn as I slowly walked toward it, almost as if I were in a trance. I reached down, picked it up, and unfurled it carefully. It read, "I'm not done with you yet." I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the note in my hand, the words searing into my mind. "I'm not done with you yet." The chill that washed over me was immediate and unmistakable. My heartbeat echoed in my ears as I slowly crumpled the note back up and stuffed it into my pocket. The room felt suffocating. Every corner seemed to close in on me as I looked around, convinced that whatever was here was still watching, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The silence in the apartment was unbearable. It was a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to magnify every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the air conditioning. I slowly stepped back into the hallway, my eyes darting to every shadow. The air felt colder than it had before, the weight of someone, or something, else in the apartment making it difficult to breathe. My phone buzzed again, this time pulling me out of my frantic thoughts. It was Jake again. This time I couldn't ignore it. I quickly pulled it out, desperate for some form of normalcy, something to anchor me to reality. I hesitated for a moment before opening the message. "James, you sure you're all right? You've been acting off. You want to talk about it." I didn't know how to respond. How could I explain to him that I was being stalked by an unseen intruder, that my own apartment no longer felt like a safe space? I couldn't. So instead, I typed out a quick response. "I'm good, just tired. I'll be okay, don't worry about me." I hit send, feeling like a coward for brushing it off, but it was easier this way. If I let anyone in, if I explained what was happening, it would only make it more real. And I wasn't sure I was ready to face that reality yet. But then my eyes landed on the hallway mirror. It was hard to explain, but I swore I saw something move in the reflection. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway behind me. My pulse quickened, but I couldn't be sure. Was it my imagination, or had something been standing just out of view, watching me? I rushed to the mirror and checked behind it. Nothing. Of course, there was nothing there. But the uneasy feeling lingered, creeping up my spine. I stepped away, my eyes nervously scanning the room. This wasn't just paranoia. There was something in this apartment, something that was trying to get to me. I needed to take action. I couldn't just sit here and wait for something worse to happen. My mind raced with possibilities. Should I call the police? Could I explain to them what was going on? I could already hear the skepticism in their voices. "Oh, you've got an intruder who left muddy footprints. Sounds like a prank to us." But it wasn't a prank, I was certain of that. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows once more. Every single one was secure. I even checked the kitchen windows, which I rarely did. I couldn't take any chances. But the more I checked, the more I realized something. It didn't matter if I locked every door, if I sealed every window. Whoever, or whatever, was doing this was inside. They knew exactly how to get in, and they could get in whenever they wanted. I paced around the apartment, the anxiety building in my chest. Every small noise sent me into a panic, my mind racing to find a logical explanation for it, but nothing made sense. The stillness of the apartment was maddening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I heard it. A sound coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. A soft shuffle like footsteps, slow, deliberate. My heart slammed against my ribcage as I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear. The footsteps were muffled, but they were definitely there. There was no mistaking it. Someone was walking around in my apartment, moving with purpose. They weren't trying to be quiet. They were taunting me, letting me know they were there. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, everything was quiet. I strained my ears, waiting for another sound, another sign that I wasn't alone, but nothing came. I stood there for what felt like hours, frozen in place, my back pressed against the wall, my breathing shallow and uneven. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out, but I couldn't. I couldn't leave. I needed to confront this. I had to know who or what was in my apartment. I waited for the silence to break, and when it did, it came in the form of a soft knock. It was just a tap, a light, almost playful knock at the door, but it felt like a hammer strike, loud and insistent in the otherwise quiet apartment. I froze again, my body trembling. Who was knocking on my door at this hour? And why was it so casual, so normal? I had no visitors. No one knew where I lived. But the knocking, it was like an invitation, as if the intruder wanted me to answer, wanted to see how far they could push me. With a shaking hand, I reached for the doorknob. I wasn't sure why I was doing this, why I was allowing this to go on, but it felt like I had no choice. I had to face whatever was on the other side. I had to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy, that this wasn't just some twisted figment of my imagination. I turned the knob. Nothing, no one was there. I blinked, confusion flooding my senses. I opened the door wider, peering down the hallway. The apartment was empty. There was no one in sight, no footprints leading away. The hallway was as quiet as ever. I stepped out into the hallway, the fear creeping back up my spine. I checked the entrance door, double-checked the locks, and confirmed it was secure. But something in my gut told me this wasn't over. It wasn't just an intruder. It was something else, something that had no intention of leaving me alone. I stepped back into the apartment and slammed the door behind me. The knocking had stopped, but the silence, it was deafening. And then I heard it again. Another soft tap. But this time, it came from the window. I could barely breathe as the tap echoed through the room, sharp and distinct, coming from the window. The sound was so quiet, so insistent, that I could feel it reverberating in my chest. I turned toward the window, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to run, to escape. But my legs felt frozen, as though some invisible force was holding me in place, forcing me to confront whatever was waiting outside. The room seemed to shrink as I stood there, staring at the window. The curtains were drawn tightly, but a sliver of light from the street lamp outside cut through, casting eerie shadows on the wall. For a moment, everything was still. The tap hadn't come again, but the air felt thick with anticipation, like something was on the verge of happening. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The tap came again, this time louder, more deliberate. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I forced my legs to move, my feet dragging across the floor as I approached the window. Every step felt like an eternity, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, a cold sweat forming on my brow. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know what was outside, but I had to. I reached for the curtain, my hand trembling. For a brief moment, I considered just leaving it closed, pretending I hadn't heard anything, pretending everything was fine. But I knew I couldn't do that. I couldn't ignore it any longer. With a sharp tug, I pulled the curtain aside, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. The street outside was empty. The sidewalk was bare and there was no one in sight. The only movement was the faint sway of the trees in the breeze, the occasional flicker of a distant streetlight. My eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement, any clue that would explain the taps. But the night was quiet, too quiet. I sighed, a mix of relief and confusion flooding through me. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was just on edge, paranoid from everything that had been happening. I glanced at the window again, checking the locks, confirming that everything was secure. But as I turned to walk away, something caught my eye. A shadow. It was barely noticeable at first, just a flicker in the corner of my vision. But when I looked closer, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the yard, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall, unmoving, its outline blurred in the darkness. My heart stopped. I wasn't sure how I hadn't seen it before. How long had it been standing there? I stepped closer to the window, trying to get a better look. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it someone waiting for me to notice them? A prank? A threat? The figure didn't move. It was as though it was waiting, just watching me. I should have called the police, but the words didn't come. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. There was something about the stillness of it, the way it seemed to be perfectly at ease in the darkness, that made my skin crawl. I turned back to the door, my hand reaching for the lock. Maybe I should get out of the apartment, go somewhere safe. But every part of me resisted. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it wanted me to know it was there. I stared at the figure for what felt like an eternity, my pulse pounding in my ears. It never moved, never made a sound. And just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the figure disappeared. Just like that. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed up by the shadows. I stumbled back, my heart racing. What was that? Was it real? Was it someone out there, or was it my mind playing tricks on me? The logical part of me told me to stop being irrational, to calm down and think this through. But the fear gnawing at me told me something else. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a long time. I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. My mind was too clouded, too consumed by the unknown, by the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I needed to get out. I needed to breathe. I couldn't think with all this pressure closing in on me. I grabbed my jacket, slipping it on hastily, and bolted for the door. My thoughts were a jumble, each one louder than the last as I stepped into the hallway. I couldn't shake the image of the figure, of those cold, unwavering eyes watching me from the darkness. It didn't matter that I hadn't seen its face. I knew it had been there. I had felt its presence. And now it was too late to go back. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the night, the cool air hitting me like a wave. I had to clear my head. I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. I couldn't be alone with my thoughts, not with the terror gnawing at me. My phone buzzed in my pocket again, and I pulled it out without thinking. It was Jake. "Where are you, man? You're scaring me. You sure you're okay?" I glanced down at the message, my fingers hovering over the screen. I wanted to tell him the truth, to let him in on what was happening, but I couldn't. I didn't know how to explain this. How could I tell him that someone, or something, was in my apartment, watching me, following me? Instead, I quickly typed out a short reply. "I'll be fine, I just need some space. I'll talk to you soon." I hit send, slipping the phone back into my pocket as I continued down the street. The night was eerily quiet, too quiet. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every gust of wind felt like a warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just waiting for me to slip up, to show weakness. I needed to get to the bottom of this. I couldn't keep running. But no matter where I went, no matter how far I walked, I knew one thing for sure. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Not now. Not ever. And I was afraid that I would never be able to escape it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched, it was more than that. It was as if something or someone was moving just out of sight, keeping pace with me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every time I turned a corner, I felt a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow shifting in the darkness, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. Just empty streets, dark windows, and the haunting silence of the night. I tried to dismiss it. I tried to tell myself that I was just paranoid, that everything was fine, that I was just overthinking things. But the fear gnawed at me, relentless, growing stronger with each step I took. I had walked aimlessly for what felt like hours, trying to clear my head, trying to outrun the terror that had taken root in my mind. But the further I went, the more I felt the weight of it pressing in on me, like a storm gathering on the horizon, ready to break. I had to go back. I knew it. I couldn't just keep running forever. My apartment was waiting, and whatever was in there, whatever was watching me, was still there. It wasn't going to go away just because I walked away from it. With a sigh, I turned around, my feet heavy with the weight of dread. I walked back toward the apartment, each step slower than the last, as if my body was trying to resist the inevitable. But I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to face whatever was lurking in that place. As I walked up the street, my eyes scanning the shadows, I caught sight of a figure in the distance, standing at the edge of the sidewalk just past the street lamp. It was tall and unnaturally still, a shape that seemed to blend into the night like it belonged there. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. There it was again, the figure, the one I had seen earlier in my yard. But this time, I wasn't imagining it. It was real. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, my body rigid with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My entire body was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that figure as possible. But my feet were glued to the ground, my legs too weak to carry me. The figure didn't move. It just stood there waiting. And then, after what felt like an eternity, it turned its head slightly, just enough for me to see its face. There was no face. No eyes, no mouth, no features at all, just an empty void where a face should be. It was like staring into a mirror and seeing nothing staring back. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind raced, searching for some kind of explanation, some way to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was none. There was no logical reason for this, no rational explanation. The figure took a step forward, then another. Slowly, deliberately, as if it knew I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. My legs finally gave out, and I collapsed to my knees, my hands trembling as I pressed them against the pavement for support. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching, slow and measured, each one sending a jolt of panic through my chest. I looked up, expecting the figure to be standing over me, but it was gone. Vanished, just like that, as if it had never been there at all. I stared at the empty street, my mind racing, my heart still pounding in my chest. What was happening? Why was this happening? What was that thing? I couldn't stay out here any longer. I had to go back to the apartment. I had to get inside, lock the doors, and make sure I was safe. I had to put distance between myself and whatever that thing was. But as I stood up, I realized something that sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over me. The apartment was only a few blocks away, and the figure had been waiting for me. It had known exactly where I was going. I turned around and sprinted toward my apartment, my footsteps echoing in the quiet street. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare stop to see if the figure was following me. I just kept running, faster and faster, until I reached the building. I rushed up the stairs to my apartment, fumbling with the keys as I tried to unlock the door. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the key in the lock. Finally, the door opened, and I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. I locked the door, checked the windows, and made sure every possible exit was sealed. I could hear my heart beating in my ears, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I was safe for now. But the fear didn't go away. It lingered, a constant weight on my chest, like something was still watching, still waiting. I sat on the couch, my back pressed against the wall, staring at the door, waiting for the next sound, the next sign that something was out there. I knew it wasn't over. I knew this was just the beginning. And the worst part, I couldn't stop thinking about the words on the paper. It's not over yet. You haven't seen the worst of it. Something told me that I hadn't even begun to understand what was coming for me, and the worst was yet to come. I couldn't shake the memory of the figure I had seen just hours ago. I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out what it all meant. The lack of a face, the way it moved, so unnaturally still, like it was waiting for me to notice it. Every time I closed my eyes, the image flashed before me, sharp and vivid, like a brand burned into my mind. It was a few hours later when my phone buzzed again. I had been pacing the apartment, trying to keep myself occupied, when I heard the familiar sound. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone and checked the message without a second thought. It was Jake again. "Dude, I'm starting to get worried about you. You haven't been answering your calls and you're acting strange. Call me, all right? I'm here if you need to talk." I stared at the screen for a long time. Jake's words were comforting, but they didn't calm me. How could I explain to him what was going on? How could I tell him about the figure, the fear, the feeling that something was wrong without sounding completely insane? I had to talk to someone, though. Maybe just hearing his voice would ground me again. I didn't care if I sounded crazy. I needed help. I needed someone to tell me this wasn't real, that I wasn't losing my mind. I hit the call button and put the phone to my ear. It rang 3 times before Jake picked up. "James," his voice was laced with concern. "Hey man, where have you been? You all right?" I don't know," I muttered. My voice sounded shaky even to me. "Something happening, something's wrong. I don't know what it is, but I can feel it." There was silence on the other end for a moment before Jake spoke again. "What are you talking about? Are you at home right now?" "Yeah." I glanced around the apartment, the familiar walls suddenly feeling strange, like they weren't mine anymore. "But there's something in here. I've seen something." "Okay, look, I'm coming over," Jake said quickly. "I'm not gonna let you deal with this alone. I'll be there in 15 minutes, all right?" Before I could respond, the line went dead. Jake had hung up. I stood there for a moment, staring at the screen of my phone, unsure of what to do next. I had no idea if Jake could help me, but I felt a slight sense of relief knowing someone was on their way. I needed someone to be here, to help me make sense of the things I couldn't explain. Even if he thought I was crazy, at least he'd be here. I put my phone down and turned back to the living room, my mind still racing with questions. Why was this happening to me? What had I done to deserve it? The doorbell rang, cutting through the tension in the room. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone else. It was too early for Jake to have arrived. I cautiously approached the door, glancing through the peephole. It was dark outside and the hallway was empty. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should open it, but the sound of the doorbell ringing again pushed me to act. I unlocked the door and pulled it open slowly. No one was there. But there, lying on the welcome mat, was an envelope. Just a plain, white envelope with no return address. No name. Nothing to identify who it was from. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling as I turned it over in my hand. My name was written on the front, scrawled in messy handwriting. There was no stamp, no indication of where it had come from. I couldn't make sense of it. Who had left this here? Why? I took the envelope inside, locking the door behind me once more. I sat down on the couch, the silence in the room feeling heavier now. I ripped open the envelope, my hands shaking as I pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. It read, "Don't trust him, he's already inside." I stared at the words for a long time, my mind racing. The paper felt colder than it should have, almost as if it had been touched by something unnatural. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't some prank. This was something else, something darker. Who had written this, and who were they talking about? I looked around the room, suddenly feeling like the walls were closing in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that I hadn't been alone for a long time. And as I sat there staring at the note, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. Slow, deliberate, like someone was waiting for the right moment to approach. I held my breath, straining to hear the movement. Could it be Jake? Had he arrived already? But then the footsteps stopped. And there was nothing. The silence in the apartment was suffocating. I sat frozen, my back pressed against the couch, the note still clutched tightly in my hand. The footsteps outside my door had stopped, but the air felt thick, heavy. I strained my ears, listening for any sound that might break the eerie stillness. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat reverberating in my skull. Could it be Jake? I had told him I was hearing things, feeling things. Maybe he was just trying to get in quickly, concerned about me. But no, it didn't sound like Jake. These steps were too deliberate, too careful, like someone knew exactly how to move without making a sound, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I glanced at the door. It was still locked, but what if someone else had gotten in? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I had to check. I had to make sure. I slowly got up, my body stiff with fear. The note was still in my hand, but I didn't dare take my eyes off the hallway. I moved quietly, almost instinctively, toward the door. My hand reached for the doorknob, trembling. The idea of opening it seemed almost unbearable, like I was about to step into a nightmare I couldn't escape. But I had no choice. If I stayed in here, I might be trapped, and if I opened the door, I might face whatever or whoever was waiting for me. I took a deep breath and slowly twisted the knob. The door creaked open, just a crack. My eyes darted around the hallway, scanning every shadow, every corner. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, nothing but darkness stretching down the length of the apartment complex. My breath escaped in a shaky exhale. Had I imagined the footsteps? Had I just been so caught up in everything that my mind had played a trick on me? I stepped out into the hallway, my heart still racing, every fiber of my being telling me to get back inside and lock the door behind me. But something inside kept me moving, pushing me further into the darkened corridor. I glanced both ways, nothing. I felt like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct screamed at me to turn around, go back inside and shut the door for good. But before I could make up my mind, I saw something. At the end of the hall, just out of sight, there was a shadow, a dark figure that didn't belong. It was standing motionless, perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for me to come out. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was too familiar. I'd seen it before just hours ago. The same shape, the same eerie stillness. I couldn't make out any details, no features, just the outline of a person. I didn't move. I couldn't. For a long moment, we just stared at each other across the distance. I couldn't see the figure's face, but I felt its gaze on me. I knew it was waiting for me to make the next move, waiting for me to react. I took a step back, but my foot hit something behind me, something heavy. I turned to see the door to my apartment had swung wide open, the dark interior stretching out in front of me. The sudden change in my surroundings made everything feel surreal. The hallway looked different, more oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. The figure in the distance didn't move. I took another step back, my breath shallow. I needed to get back inside to lock myself away from whatever that thing was, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. It was like I was frozen, unable to tear myself away from the sight of it standing there, watching me. I turned back to the apartment, but the second I did, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps approaching from behind. It was too quiet for anyone to be making any noise by accident, too purposeful. Someone, or something, was coming up the hall toward me. I spun around. The figure was gone. I searched the hallway, my heart in my throat. I couldn't make sense of it. I had been staring at it just seconds ago, and now it was gone. But the footsteps, they were still there, getting closer, impossibly close. I turned back toward my apartment and bolted inside. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I twisted the lock into place. I backed away from the door, my chest tight with panic. I glanced around my apartment, now feeling more like a prison than a place of refuge. Every corner seemed darker, every shadow deeper. I could feel the pressure building, like the walls were closing in on me. And then, in the middle of that silence, the doorbell rang. I froze. There was no way I was going to answer it. I wasn't ready to face whatever was on the other side of that door, especially not after what I had just seen. The doorbell rang again, and then again. I glanced down at the note in my hand. The words were burned into my mind, echoing like a warning I couldn't escape. Don't trust him. He's already inside. But the question still burned inside me. Who was he, and how had I let this happen? I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave. I needed to get away. But where could I go? Would anywhere be safe? Or was this just the beginning of whatever was happening to me? The doorbell rang again. The doorbell rang again, this time louder, more insistent, as though the person on the other side was growing impatient. The sound vibrated in my skull, sending waves of panic crashing through me. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't answer it. Not with everything that had happened, not with the figure in the hallway, the footsteps, and the cryptic note that I still clutched in my trembling hand. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I knew I couldn't just hide in here forever. The doorbell wasn't going to stop ringing, and the figure from the hallway, whoever or whatever it was, wasn't going to just go away. I could feel the weight of its presence, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. What had I gotten myself into? The questions swirled around in my mind, but there were no answers, only more uncertainty. Another ring. This time it felt like a warning. I glanced around my apartment, the once familiar space now feeling alien, hostile. The shadows seemed to move on their own, creeping along the walls as if they were alive. The walls felt closer now, the air thicker. I could hear my own breath, quick and shallow, as I tried to steady my nerves. I glanced at my phone, but there were no new messages, no calls, nothing from Jake, who I hadn't heard from since the last time I checked. I thought about calling him, but would it even help? What could he do? What was I supposed to say? Hey, I think I'm being stalked by a mysterious figure and I'm hearing things. Can you come over and help? It was ridiculous. And yet, here I was, standing frozen in my own apartment, watching the door like some nightmare that refused to end. The doorbell rang again, and then again even louder. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking so violently that it was a miracle I didn't drop the note in my hand. The cold metal of the knob felt like ice against my skin. I turned it slowly, heart pounding in my ears. Each click of the lock echoed through the apartment like a gunshot. The door creaked open just a sliver, and I stared into the darkness beyond. The hallway was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me, waiting. I stepped into the hallway, every instinct telling me to go back inside, to lock the door and hide, but I forced myself to take another step forward. The lights in the hall were dim, casting long, stretched-out shadows that danced across the floor like phantom figures. I glanced around, trying to see anything out of place, but the hallway appeared just as normal as it always had. Still, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was lurking just beyond the light. I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" The only response was the echo of my own voice bouncing off the walls. No answer. I took another step forward, my breath coming in short bursts. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn back, to go inside and lock the door again, but I was too far gone now. I had to find out what was happening. I had to know who was behind all of this. And then, as if on cue, I heard the footsteps. Soft at first, just a faint tapping of shoes against the linoleum floor. But as they drew closer, the sound became more distinct, more purposeful. Someone was walking toward me, and they were getting closer with every step. I turned sharply, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, stretching out into the shadows, yet the sound of the footsteps persisted, echoing in the quiet. I felt my stomach tighten in knots, the terror clawing at me. The footsteps were getting closer. Whoever was out there was just around the corner, and I didn't know what to do. I took a step back, my feet feeling heavy as if the floor was swallowing me whole. My pulse raced as the footsteps grew louder, closer. I had to get back inside. I had to lock the door. But when I turned around, I froze. Standing in the doorway of my apartment was a figure. The same figure I had seen earlier, but now it was closer, just a few feet away. The shadows obscured most of their form, but I could make out the outline of a person, tall and thin, standing motionless in the doorway. My heart skipped a beat. This couldn't be happening, this couldn't be real. I took a step back, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there watching me, waiting. "What do you want?" I forced the words out, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there as if it was studying me, waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat as the seconds stretched on, stretching into an eternity. And then, without warning, the figure stepped forward. I stumbled back, my hands fumbling for the door. I didn't care anymore. I didn't care about what was going to happen next. I just needed to escape. but the door wouldn't close, it wouldn't lock. The figure was getting closer. My pulse thundered in my ears. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at the figure, my mind racing for any way out, any way to escape the nightmare that was closing in on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. I stood frozen in the hallway, every muscle in my body tense with fear. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but it was impossible. The figure was gone. There was no trace, no sign of anyone or anything. But the footsteps, the ones that had been following me, were still there, faint but unmistakable. They were moving closer. The footsteps grew louder, sharper, and more distinct. They were no longer faint echoes fading into the background. No, this time they were right behind me, each step resonating through the walls and floor like a pounding drum. I could feel the cold sweat creeping down my back, my heartbeat racing in my chest. The sensation of being hunted, of something, or someone, approaching me was overwhelming. My throat tightened and every instinct screamed for me to turn around, to face whatever was following me, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place as the sound of those steps intensified. I glanced behind me, but the hallway was still empty. Empty, yet the footsteps were undeniable, growing closer and closer, as though they were right at my heels. A wave of nausea washed over me, and for a moment I felt like I might collapse right there in the hall. I slowly turned my head again, eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The silence that followed was suffocating. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own pulse, thumping like a drumbeat in my ears. Suddenly the footsteps stopped. A deathly stillness filled the space between us. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. I stood there, barely breathing, unsure if I should move or stay completely still. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, but one thing was clear: I wasn't alone. It was as though the silence was waiting for something. For a moment, it felt like the world itself had frozen, holding its breath. Then, without warning, I heard a soft whisper, so faint I almost didn't catch it. "James." My name. It was my name, but it wasn't my voice. I spun around, my back crashing into the wall, my heart skipping a beat. No one was there. There wasn't even the faintest trace of anyone standing behind me, but I could feel their presence. It was suffocating, like an oppressive weight pushing down on me, making it harder and harder to breathe. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "James." It sounded like a voice from the past, familiar, yet distorted, as if it had been filtered through layers of static, as though it were being spoken from the farthest reaches of my mind. A wave of cold fear washed over me as I realized the voice wasn't just unfamiliar, it was something far worse. It was something I couldn't place, and that made it all the more terrifying. I had to move, I had to get out of here. I turned to face the door, but as I took a step toward it, the lights in the hallway flickered. A sharp buzzing sound rang out from the light above me, and in the brief moment when the light went completely out, I felt it. A cold gust of air brushed against the back of my neck, a chill that made every hair on my body stand on end. I whipped around, only to find the hallway still empty. But I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore, the feeling of being watched, of something or someone just out of sight, hiding in the shadows, waiting for me to slip up. I reached for my phone, desperate to call Jake, desperate for any kind of connection to the outside world. But my hands trembled too much to unlock it. I could barely get my fingers to work as I fumbled with the screen, trying to find his contact. The phone buzzed in my hand. I almost dropped it, but I caught it just in time, a tight breath escaping my chest. I was expecting it to be Jake, but when I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. There was a new message, but the sender was Jake. It was an unknown number. I hesitated for only a second before I opened it. My hands shook, and I felt like I might pass out right there in the hallway. The message read, "You should have stayed inside, James." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. How did they know my name? Who was this? I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. My thoughts raced a mile a minute, but none of them made any sense. What did this person want from me? And why had they been following me all day? Another message appeared on the screen. I read it without thinking. It's too late now, you can't hide anymore. I felt the blood drain from my face. The air around me seemed to thicken like I was suffocating, like something was closing in on me from every direction. Panic surged through me, making my heart beat harder, faster. I shoved the phone back into my pocket and bolted toward the door. There was no way I was going to let whatever this was corner me. But as I grabbed the doorknob, I felt a sharp pull on my wrist. It wasn't physical, at least, not in a way that made sense. It was like an invisible force, tugging me back, holding me in place, preventing me from moving. I tried to turn the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the door had been locked from the other side, even though I knew it hadn't been. I turned to face the hallway again, eyes scanning the space. The footsteps had returned, louder this time, drawing closer, relentless. My breath came in shallow gasps, my body trembling. I couldn't escape. I couldn't outrun this. The door was locked. The hallway was empty, but the sound of those footsteps filled the air, surrounding me. They were everywhere now. I couldn't tell which direction they were coming from, but I could feel the presence of whoever, or whatever, was pursuing me. I couldn't fight it, I couldn't even understand what was happening, but I had no choice. I had to keep moving, keep fighting, keep surviving. With a deep, shaky breath, I turned back toward the door, my hand gripping the knob tightly. The footsteps grew louder, now almost at my heels. The door had to open. It had to. But when I twisted the knob once more, it turned. And as the door creaked open, the hallway stretched out before me, empty, waiting. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. And then the whisper came again, soft but unmistakable. "James." I stepped into the hallway, every instinct telling me to run, to escape whatever had been lurking in the shadows. But the silence surrounding me was deafening, and the whispers that had plagued me seemed to grow louder the more I moved. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat echoing in my ears like a ticking clock. I could still feel the presence, that oppressive weight pressing down on me, as though something were watching my every move. The air felt thick, stifling, and I couldn't tell whether it was fear or something else making it hard to breathe. With every step I took, the hallway stretched longer, darker. It wasn't the same hallway I had walked down moments ago. No, this one felt different. The walls were closing in, the dim lighting flickering as if the electricity itself was on the verge of giving out. I hesitated, my fingers brushing the walls as I moved, trying to steady myself. But no matter how hard I tried, my body felt like it was moving on its own, pushed forward by some unseen force. I turned back to look at the door, but it was gone. The familiar entrance I had just passed through had vanished, leaving only a void behind. I reached out, my fingers brushing against nothing, but the air felt strangely cold, like the temperature had dropped in an instant. Then I heard it again, the footsteps. They were no longer behind me. They were ahead of me, coming toward me, louder, closer, more rapid. I spun around, eyes searching for any sign of movement, but I couldn't see anyone. The hallway was empty, just like it had been before. But the sound of the footsteps grew louder, as though whoever was walking toward me was right around the corner. I could feel them getting closer, almost on top of me. My heart raced as I backed away, but the steps kept coming, relentless and unforgiving. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the hall. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was shrouded in darkness, too far away to make out any distinguishing features, but I knew it was the same presence I had felt all this time. It was coming for me. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The weight in my chest grew heavier and I felt paralyzed, like I was stuck in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The figure didn't move, it just stood there watching me. The footsteps stopped, but the presence didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel my pulse in my neck, my hands trembling at my sides. The figure began to move toward me slowly, deliberately. With each step, the darkness seemed to shift and warp, swallowing the light and twisting the air around it. I wanted to close my eyes, to turn away, but I couldn't. I was frozen, stuck in place as the figure approached. When it was just a few feet away, it stopped. The air around me grew colder, the temperature dropping drastically, and I could see my breath in the air. My vision blurred, my heart hammering in my chest, but I couldn't look away. I had to know what it was. The figure raised its hand, and for the first time I saw its face, or at least what was left of it. The face was a twisted mockery of a human, pale and featureless, with dark hollow eyes that seemed to peer straight through me. The mouth was a thin, almost non-existent line, stretched impossibly wide. I couldn't tell whether it was smiling or if it was something far worse. The more I looked, the more I felt the sense that I was seeing something that wasn't meant to exist in this world. And then it spoke. "James." The voice was low, guttural, but familiar, like it was reaching out from the depths of my memories. The name sounded twisted, like it was taunting me. The words felt like a dagger to the chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was like I had been drawn into this nightmarish reality where nothing made sense, where everything I had known and trusted was slipping through my fingers. "You shouldn't have ignored the signs," the figure continued, its voice reverberating in the air, filling the space around me. "You should have listened." The ground beneath me trembled, and I felt an unrelenting pull toward the figure. It was like gravity itself was changing, and I couldn't escape it. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't find the words. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. But one thing was certain. I had been wrong. I had underestimated whatever this was, whatever I had been running from. The figure reached out, its hand closing in on me. I braced myself, unable to move or resist, feeling the chill of its touch before I even made contact. And then everything went dark. For a moment I was floating, lost in an inky blackness. There was no sound, no movement, just the oppressive silence that seemed to stretch on forever. But even in that darkness I could feel it. The presence, the weight, still hovering over me, watching, waiting. I reached out in the darkness, but there was nothing to grasp. The void swallowed my hand, my arm, pulling me deeper into nothingness. It was as though I were being consumed by the very air itself. And then the whisper came again. "James." This time it wasn't distant, it wasn't in the hallway, it was right next to me. It was in my ear. "James, you're mine now." The words echoed through my mind as I was pulled further into the abyss, and I understood in that moment that whatever this was, it wasn't over. It wasn't over at all. As the words echoed in my mind, the chilling realization set in. This, whatever this was, had never been about some twisted game or an intruder lurking in the shadows. It had never been about the figure or the house. It was about me. I had been the one pulling the strings, and I had been the one caught in the web. I tried to move, to free myself from the grasp of the darkness that was slowly consuming me, but it was no use. Every time I thought I might escape, the grip tightened, dragging me further down. The void was endless, and every thought I had seemed to dissipate, leaving me in a haze of confusion. But through the endless darkness there was one thing I could still hear, my own heartbeat. It was faint, but it was there. Thump, 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 echoing in the silence. And it was the only thing that kept me tethered to the world I had once known. The whisper came again, its voice even closer now, right beside me, as if it was crawling into my mind. "You should have never ignored the signs, James. You should have listened." With a final breath, I closed my eyes, allowing myself to surrender to the abyss. I knew there was no coming back from this. There was no escape. It was over. But as everything faded to black, one final thought crossed my mind. The house was still out there. The door was still open, waiting for the next one. And in that moment, I realized what I had known all along. I hadn't been the first, and I wouldn't be the last. The void swallowed me whole, and all that remained was silence.